The lonely teacher and the two runaway children. One stormy night changes everything. 1818, Hudson Valley. One stormy night, teacher Abigail Hartwell, living alone, without a husband or anyone to protect her, hears a desperate knock at her door. Outside are two shivering, starving children, bearing wounds and a dangerous secret they dare not name. Abigail knows that opening the door tonight could ruin everything she has built, but she opens it anyway. And from that moment, nothing will ever be the same again. Please like, comment with the city or country you're watching to let me know how far my story has come. And subscribe to be part of our family. Don't miss the next stories. The storm had been building since late afternoon, the kind that came off the river with a grudge. By nightfall, it had swallowed the Hudson Valley whole. Wind stripping leaves from trees that had stood for a century, rain hammering the earth in sheets so thick a lantern was useless past 10 feet. Abigail Hartwell had shuttered her windows, bolted her door, and settled beside the fire with a cup of tea gone cold, a stack of student compositions she couldn't focus on, and the particular silence of a woman who has grown used to her own company but never quite comfortable with it. She was 31 years old and had been living alone in this house for 4 years. The house wasn't much. 2 rooms downstairs, a sleeping loft above, a garden that produced more weeds than vegetables, and a schoolroom attached to the east side where she taught the children of Harwick Township every morning except Sunday. The township had given her the position reluctantly. Women school teachers were considered a temporary arrangement, something you tolerated until a qualified man could be found. 4 years later, no qualified man had materialized, and Abigail had stopped waiting for one. She had built something here. Not comfort, exactly. Not happiness in the way she'd imagined it when she was younger, but something steadier than either of those. A life that was hers, built from her own choices and her own labor, and that counted for more than she'd expected it to. So when the knocking came at her door, hard and frantic against the storm, her first reaction was not concern, it was irritation. No one knocked on doors at this hour in weather like this unless something had gone badly wrong. And badly wrong things had a way of becoming your problem once you opened the door to them. She knew this. She had learned it the hard way, back in her mother's house, where badly wrong things arrived without warning and rearranged your entire life before you'd finished your breakfast. She set down the compositions, picked up the lantern, and crossed the room. "Who's there?" she called through the wood. No answer, just the rain. Then another knock, lower this time, like whoever was doing it was running out of strength. Abigail unbolted the door. The 2 children nearly fell into her. The boy caught himself on the doorframe. He was maybe 10 years old, tall for his age, with dark hair plastered flat against his forehead, and eyes that were doing the particular kind of blinking that meant he was working very hard not to cry. He had one arm wrapped around the girl beside him, who was smaller, maybe 6, and she had her face buried against his ribs and was making no sound at all. That absence of sound was the thing that stopped Abigail cold. Children that small, soaked through to the skin in a storm like this, should have been screaming. "Come in," Abigail said. She didn't think about it. She just stepped back and held the door wide. The boy moved them both inside with a care that was startling in someone his age. He positioned himself so that his body stayed between his sister and the open doorway until Abigail shut and bolted it again. Then he stood there dripping on her floorboards, jaw set, looking at her with an expression that was trying to be suspicious but was too exhausted to hold the shape. "What's your name?" Abigail asked. "Samuel." He paused, like he was deciding something. "Samuel Reed. This is Mercy." Abigail crouched down to the girl's level. Mercy had dark eyes, the same shade as her brother's, and they were open now, fixed on Abigail with an intensity that was unnerving in a child that young. She didn't speak. She pressed herself tighter against Samuel's side. "Are you hurt?" Abigail asked. Samuel's jaw tightened. "She doesn't talk much." "That's all right." Abigail rose. "Can you walk, Mercy?" The girl gave a small nod. "Good. Come to the fire, both of you." She got them dry clothes, her own, cut down inadequately with a knife, and pinned where they were still too wide, and she fed them what she had, which was cold cornbread and the remnants of a bean stew she'd made 2 days ago. Samuel ate with a controlled desperation, taking measured bites, never taking more than his share. He gave Mercy the larger portion. Mercy ate without looking up from the bowl. Abigail watched them and didn't ask questions. Not yet. Some things you had to let settle before you could approach them. When the bowls were empty, she set water on to boil and sat across the table from Samuel. He was watching her the way a dog watches an unfamiliar hand. Not hostile exactly, but measuring. "How far did you walk?" she asked. "From the Whitcomb house." He said the name carefully, like it might have teeth. Abigail knew the Whitcomb house. Everyone in Harwick Township knew the Whitcomb house. It sat on a hill north of the village, 3 stories of stone and imported timber. More house than any single family needed, but the Whitcombs had never been people who believed in sufficiency. Nathaniel Whitcomb was the last of the name. His parents dead, no siblings, wealthy in the particular way of people who had inherited wealth rather than made it, and had no clear idea what to do with that fact. Abigail had seen him occasionally in the village. He was younger than she'd expected when she'd first heard the name, perhaps 35, and he carried himself with the distracted air of a man perpetually waiting for something to tell him what to do next. She had not known there were children in that house. "That's nearly 2 miles," she said. "In this weather." "I know." Samuel's chin came up slightly. "I carried Mercy most of the way." "I can see that." She looked at his arms. The sleeves of her overlarge shirt had been pushed up, and she saw the marks then. Not all of them at once. A darkness across the inside of one forearm that wasn't shadow. Old bruising, yellow at the edges, with something newer and angrier layered over it. She kept her face still. "Samuel," she said carefully, "are there other people at the Whitcomb house besides Mr. Whitcomb?" The boy's expression closed like a shutter. "His aunt lives there." "Mrs. Prudence Whitcomb?" A pause, then, "Yes, ma'am." Abigail had heard of Prudence Whitcomb too, though she'd never seen the woman face to face. What she'd heard was not reassuring. A widow of 60-odd years, sharp-tongued and convinced of her own rectitude, who had moved into the Whitcomb house 2 years ago and had, by most accounts, taken it over entirely. The servants had a high turnover rate. The tradesmen who dealt with the house had stopped sending their junior people. "How long have you and Mercy been living at the Whitcomb house?" Abigail asked. Samuel's hands, flat on the table, pressed down against the wood. 8 months. "And before that?" "With our father, Captain Elias Reed." He said it with a pride that had been recently damaged. You could hear the crack in it, the way you hear a hairline fracture in old porcelain. "He died in January. Fever. He had arrangements made for us beforehand." A beat. "Mr. Whitcomb was his friend. From the war." Abigail absorbed this. A soldier's children, handed off to a friend who perhaps hadn't understood what he was agreeing to. It was not an uncommon story. It was rarely a happy one. "Your father sounds like he was a careful man," she said. Something shifted in Samuel's face, a tightening around the eyes. "He was the most careful man I've ever known." His voice went flat at the end, the way voices do when grief is still too close to the surface, and the only way to speak around it is to drain the feeling out entirely. Mercy made a small sound. Not a word. Just a sound, low and exhausted. She had fallen asleep sitting up, her head tipping sideways against Samuel's arm. Samuel caught her without looking, the movement automatic, worn into his muscles by habit. "She can have the bed in the loft," Abigail said. "You take the bench by the fire. It's too late and too wet to decide anything else tonight." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you helping us?" It was a genuine question, not a challenge. He really wanted to know. "Because you knocked on my door," Abigail said, "and you needed somewhere to be." He considered this. "We can't go back there." "I heard you." "She'll come looking." "I expect she will." "And you're not—" He stopped. Started again. "You don't seem frightened." Abigail reached for the poker and adjusted the fire. "I'm going to tell you something true, Samuel, since you seem like someone who can handle true things. I'm not foolish enough to think Prudence Whitcomb coming to my door won't be a problem. It will be a problem, but it won't be tonight, and tonight is what matters right now." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My father used to say something like that." Did he? He said, "The battle you're in is the only battle, not the one that might come tomorrow." Samuel's mouth twisted slightly. He said soldiers who fight tomorrow's battle today lose both. He was right, Abigail said. She carried Mercy up to the loft herself, the child limp and heavy with sleep against her shoulder. When she came back down, Samuel was still sitting at the table, upright, not relaxing against the back of the chair. She thought he probably hadn't let himself fully relax in 8 months. "Sleep," she told him. "I'll keep watch." "You don't have to." "Samuel." She pulled a blanket from the chest by the wall and dropped it over the bench. "Go to sleep." He lay down. He was asleep in 4 minutes. She timed it because she was watching, the way you watch something that is in the process of revealing itself to you. She did keep watch. She sat at the table with the compositions she still couldn't read, the fire burning low, and she thought about Captain Elias Reed, who had been careful enough to arrange for his children's futures and unlucky enough to have put them in the wrong hands. Around midnight, when the storm had dulled to a steady rain, she lit a second candle and went to hang the children's wet clothing near the fire. Samuel's coat fell open as she lifted it, and something slid out of the inner pocket and hit the floor with a soft, particular sound. The sound of metal on wood, heavier than a coin. She picked it up. It was a compass. Silver, worn smooth at the edges, the case engraved with a design she had to hold close to the candle to read. A small sailing ship on one side, and on the other 2 words in a tight, careful hand. "Find home." She turned it over in her palm. The needle held steady north, indifferent to the storm outside, to the 2 sleeping children, to all of it. She set it on the table where Samuel would see it when he woke, and she went back to her chair. The knock came before dawn, not frantic like the children's had been. This was a controlled knock. 3 measured strikes, the knock of someone who is accustomed to doors being opened for them. Abigail had her musket down from the wall before she reached the door. She wasn't going to use it, probably, but she had learned that holding it changed how conversations went, and she suspected this conversation was going to need all the help it could get. She opened the door. The man outside was not what she'd expected. She had been braced for Mrs. Prudence Whitcomb herself, or for a constable, or for some armed servant sent ahead of one or both. Instead, she found Nathaniel Whitcomb standing alone in the thin gray light before sunrise, his hat ruined by rain, his coat soaked through, looking for all the world like a man who had walked the 2 miles from his house and was not entirely sure he deserved a roof over his head when he arrived. He was taller than she'd thought, seeing him at a distance in the village, dark circles under his eyes, a jaw that hadn't been shaved in at least 2 days, and an expression that was doing several contradictory things at once, relief and shame, and something harder underneath both of them that she couldn't quite name yet. He looked at the musket. "I'm not here to take them back against their will," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, steadier than the rest of him looked. "That's a good start," Abigail said. "What are you here for?" He exhaled. "To make sure they're alive and to tell you—" He stopped, pressed his mouth closed, tried again. "To tell you that whatever they said about why they left, they were telling the truth." Abigail studied him for a moment. In her experience, men who led with an admission rather than a demand were either genuinely contrite or dangerously clever, and the two were harder to tell apart than people supposed. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, a specific kind of defeat, the kind that comes from being honest with yourself about something you'd rather not be honest about, that didn't read as performance. "Come in," she said, and stepped back. "But the musket stays where I can reach it." "That's fair," Nathaniel said, and he came inside. She woke Samuel before she sat Nathaniel down. She thought the boy deserved to know who was in the house before he stumbled across it, and she was right. When Samuel came down the loft ladder and saw Nathaniel at the table, he went very still, and his expression moved through several things quickly: fear, calculation, and then something that settled into a wary, grudging readiness. Nathaniel looked at Samuel for a long moment. His throat moved. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Both of you. Are you hurt?" "We're fine," Samuel said. The word fine came out clipped and unconvincing. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He didn't push it. "I'm glad you're here," he said instead. "I spent 2 hours looking for you in that storm before I—" He stopped. "I was afraid." "You were afraid," Samuel repeated. There was nothing inflammatory in his tone. He was just examining the words, turning them over, testing their weight. "Yes." "She locked Mercy in the cellar," Samuel said, flat, factual, like he was reporting a measurement. "For 3 days, for knocking over a candle holder." The silence in the room changed quality. Nathaniel closed his eyes. 1 breath. 2. When he opened them, they were wet at the corners, and he didn't try to hide it or address it. "I know," he said. "I didn't know when it was happening, but I know now." "You were in the house," Samuel said. "I was." No excuse, no qualification, just the word. Abigail watched Samuel, and she watched Nathaniel, and she thought about the particular complexity of a situation where the person who failed you was not a villain, not cleanly, not simply, but just a man who hadn't paid enough attention until it was too late. "Sit down, Samuel," she said. "Both of you, sit down. Someone put the water on to boil, and we're going to talk through what happened from the beginning." It took the better part of an hour. Samuel talked. Nathaniel listened, and occasionally he put his face in his hands, and occasionally he asked a quiet question. And he did not once try to minimize or redirect what Samuel was saying. Mercy stayed in the loft. Abigail had checked on her twice. The girl was awake. She could hear them talking, but she wasn't coming down yet, and Abigail wasn't going to force her. The story that emerged was not a clean one. It rarely was, in cases like this. Elias Reed had trusted Nathaniel Whitcomb with his children because they had served together in the war, 2 young men thrown into the same horror, and that kind of bond had a weight to it that civilian friendship rarely matched. Nathaniel had agreed to take the children because refusing would have been a betrayal of everything that bond meant. He had not thought clearly about whether he was prepared for it, or about the woman already living in his house who had strong opinions about order and discipline and the proper place of other people's children. Prudence Whitcomb had moved in 14 months ago, after the death of her second husband, who had left her comfortable but not wealthy enough for her own tastes. Nathaniel, without a clear sense of how to refuse his only surviving relative, had said yes, and then he had done what he often did with problems that confused him. He had retreated into his study, his accounts, his library, and the comfortable fiction that things in the household were being managed correctly because they appeared from a distance to be managed at all. Prudence had not been openly cruel at first. That was the particular skill of such people. They understood the value of gradual escalation, of normalizing small cruelties before moving to larger ones, of making the target of their behavior believe that the problem was their own sensitivity rather than the behavior itself. The children had arrived in March, 8 months ago, winter still in the air. They had been grieving, raw and close to the surface with it, a father dead only 6 weeks. Prudence had met this grief with brisk efficiency, no dwelling, no softness, no exceptions made for children who were not yet done crying. Meals at specific times, silence at the table, punishment for noise and disorder, and the 1,000 small infractions that grieving children commit simply by existing in their grief. By summer, it had gotten worse. Abigail could hear it in the way Samuel described it. A careful accounting of specifics, dates, and incidents, the kind of catalog a person keeps when they've already decided they're going to need it someday. The incident with Mercy in the cellar had been 3 weeks ago. Samuel had gone to Nathaniel that same night, had told him, had shown him Mercy's hands where she'd scraped them on the cellar wall trying to find the door in the dark. Nathaniel had confronted Prudence. Prudence had said that Mercy needed discipline, that Samuel was exaggerating, and had said it all with such perfect, composed authority that Nathaniel, who had spent his entire life being managed by composed, authoritative people, had wavered. He hadn't resolved it. He had left it unresolved, which meant it had stayed in place, which meant Prudence had understood that she had weathered the only real challenge to her authority and had adjusted accordingly. Last night, Prudence had locked the door to Mercy's room. Not as a punishment for anything specific. Samuel couldn't point to a triggering incident. That was the thing that had finally broken whatever calculation he'd been running. When cruelty stopped requiring a reason, you had reached a different kind of problem entirely. He had gotten Mercy out through the window. They had run. When Samuel finished, the room was quiet except for the fire and the rain, which had softened overnight to something almost gentle. "She has legal papers," Nathaniel said. His voice was rough. "Guardianship papers. I signed them in March, thinking it was just a formality, making the arrangement official. I didn't read them carefully enough." He looked at Abigail directly. "She's going to use them." "She's going to come here," Abigail said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, probably today." He reached into his coat and set something on the table, a folded letter. "That's what Elias wrote to me, before he died. I've read it a dozen times and done an insufficient job of following it. He didn't open it. He just left it there. He asked me to keep them safe. He asked me to make sure they knew their father loved them. He asked me to—" His voice broke very slightly on the last word. He took a breath. "He trusted me." Abigail looked at the letter. She looked at Samuel, who was looking at Nathaniel with the careful, complicated expression of someone encountering something unexpected and not yet sure what to do with it. "He did trust you," Abigail said, "and that trust has been badly kept." She watched something in Nathaniel's face receive this without flinching. "But we're talking about what can still be fixed, not what can't be." "Can it be fixed?" Samuel asked. He wasn't asking Abigail. He was asking Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at the boy. "I don't know," he said, "but I'm going to try, and I'm going to need you to help me, if you're willing." Samuel's expression did the complicated thing again. Children who have been let down by adults develop a particular relationship with hope. They want it. They distrust wanting it. They resent both the wanting and the distrust simultaneously. "I want to see Mercy first," Samuel said finally. "Go up," Abigail told him. He went. They heard him on the ladder, heard the low murmur of his voice above, and then a silence that was different from the one before it, warmer somehow, more inhabited. Abigail poured 2 cups of bitter coffee and set one in front of Nathaniel. "Tell me about Prudence," she said. "Tell me everything that might matter when she comes through my door." Nathaniel wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, the rain continued its steady work, and somewhere above them 2 children were doing the small, essential task of making sure the other one was still there. He told her. By the time he'd finished, the sun was up behind the clouds, throwing a gray, flat light through the windows. Abigail's fire had burned low, and she'd fed it twice. Her coffee was cold, and she hadn't drunk much of it. Prudence Whitcomb was 63 years old, twice widowed, and had navigated both marriages and both deaths, with the focused efficiency of someone who had understood from an early age that security was not given to women. It was taken, through whatever means were available. Abigail could almost respect the logic of it, in the abstract. What she couldn't respect was the translation of that logic into the management of 2 grieving children, as though they were accounts to be balanced. Prudence had a solicitor in Yonkers who was apparently both capable and loyal. She had connections in the county court through her second husband's family. She had, and this was the part Abigail kept returning to, signed guardianship papers that Nathaniel had not read carefully, which meant her legal position might be considerably stronger than it deserved to be. "She'll come after the school," Nathaniel said. He was watching Abigail carefully. "She'll go to the township council. She'll say you took in 2 children under cover of night without notifying any authority, that you're harboring them against their lawful guardian's wishes. She'll make it a question of your fitness as a teacher and as a member of this community." Abigail stared at the cold fireplace. "I'm aware," she said. "You could still—" He stopped himself, closed his mouth. Then, "No. I was going to say you could still send them back or send them to the constable and avoid the trouble. But I don't think you're going to do that." "No," she said. "I'm not." "Why not?" She looked at him. It was an honest question, same as Samuel's had been the night before. The same quality of genuine curiosity, of trying to understand something that didn't fit the usual pattern. "Because Mercy didn't speak last night," Abigail said. "She ate. She let me carry her to bed. But she didn't say a word. And she should have. She's 6 years old, and her brother told me she used to chatter constantly, used to drive him half to madness with questions." She set her cup down. "Children go silent for reasons. And the reasons usually look like someone's hands. Nathaniel's expression went somewhere painful. She used to sing, he said quietly. Her father taught her a song. She sang it for weeks after she arrived. Prudence told her to stop. And she stopped. Yes. Abigail stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she had a way of taking up her full space that made her feel larger than her actual height. Then here's what I think, Mr. Whitcomb. Your aunt is going to arrive at my door today with papers and a solicitor and the full weight of her social position, and she is going to expect me to fold because I have no husband, no property beyond this house, and no political connections worth mentioning. What she doesn't understand yet is that those things are not what I've built my life on. Nathaniel was watching her. What have you built it on? The truth, she said. It's a narrow foundation. It doesn't always hold, but it's the only one I trust. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Elias would have liked you. I'd like to think so, Abigail said, but right now I'd rather deal with the problem he left behind. She went to the window. Down the road, through the thinning rain, the village of Harwick Township was beginning its morning. Smoke from chimneys, a cart moving, a dog barking at something. A normal morning, the kind that had no idea what was coming toward it. Above her she could hear Mercy's voice, not words, not quite, but sound. A small tentative thread of sound, the beginning of something that had been pressed down and was now, very cautiously, trying to find the air again. Abigail turned from the window. All right, she said, let's figure out what we're going to do when she gets here. Nathaniel Whitcomb was not a man who talked easily about his failures. Abigail could see that in the way he approached it, carefully, with long pauses, choosing words the way a man chooses footing on uncertain ground. But he talked, and that she was beginning to understand was itself a kind of effort that didn't come naturally to him. He told her about prudence, the way you tell someone about a wound you've been pretending isn't there, in pieces. With a reluctance that kept interrupting itself. Prudence Whitcomb had arrived at the house on a Tuesday in October, 14 months ago, with 3 trunks of clothing, a personal maid, and an opinion about every room she walked into. Nathaniel had not known how to say no to her. That was the plain truth of it, and he said it without dressing it up. She was his father's sister. She was the last family he had, and he had spent his entire life understanding that saying no to Prudence Whitcomb was not a thing that happened without consequences. His father had understood it. His mother had understood it. It had been the quiet organizing fact of his childhood that Prudence's opinions about how things ought to be were not really opinions at all. They were simply the way things were going to be. She managed my father the same way, Nathaniel said. He was looking at his cold coffee. He was a strong man in most respects, not with her. With her, he just gave ground. I always told myself I'd be different. He paused. I wasn't. Most people aren't, Abigail said. Not to comfort him, just because it was true. It doesn't excuse it. No, it doesn't. He glanced at her, something shifting slightly in his expression. He'd expected either absolution or condemnation, and she'd given him neither, and he wasn't quite sure what to do with that. She watched him recalibrate and kept her own face level. Upstairs, she could hear Samuel's voice and the occasional soft sound from Mercy. Still not words, but the texture of sound had changed from the night before. There was a quality to it now that was almost conversational. Almost. The guardianship papers, Abigail said. Tell me exactly what they say, as much as you remember. Nathaniel rubbed the back of his neck. They name me as primary guardian, which is what Elias intended. But there's a secondary clause. Prudence had her solicitor draft it separately, and she brought it to me along with a dozen other household documents to sign. I signed everything at once. I was distracted. I had accounts that needed attention, and I thought it was a formality, a household matter. He set down the cup. The secondary clause gives Prudence authority to act as guardian in my absence or in cases of my incapacity. She's been arguing to her solicitor that my failure to properly manage the household constitutes a form of incapacity. Abigail was quiet for a moment. And does the solicitor agree? He's been paid to agree. Nathaniel's voice went flat. His name is Gideon Hale. He's been working for Prudence's family in one form or another for 20 years. He's not corrupt in the obvious sense. He wouldn't fabricate documents or bribe a judge outright. but he knows how to read language in whatever direction his client needs it to go, and he's good enough at it that it's hard to argue with him in the moment. We'll need to argue with him out of the moment then, Abigail said, before he gets here. Nathaniel looked at her directly. You have a plan? I have the beginning of one, which is not the same thing, but it's what we have. She stood and went to the window again. The rain had gone to mist, the kind that soaks you without the drama of actual rainfall. Through it, she could see her schoolroom attached to the east side of the house, its windows dark. The township council gave me this position and this house. If Prudence goes to them, they'll listen to her. She's a Whitcomb, and Whitcomb money has been in this county longer than most of the councilmen's families. But listening isn't the same as agreeing. I've taught most of their children. A few of them I've taught well. She turned back. They're not all against me. She'll make it about propriety, Nathaniel said, taking in unaccompanied children at night without notifying anyone. She'll make it sound... I know what she'll make it sound like, Abigail said. I've been a single woman in a small town for 4 years. I'm familiar with the shape of that argument. She moved to the hearth and began building the fire back up, feeding it with the particular competence of someone who has done it 10,000 times. What I need to know is what evidence exists of the abuse, beyond what Samuel says. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a woman named Clara Briggs. She was a kitchen servant at the house. Prudence dismissed her 3 months ago, said she was insolent, but the real reason was that Clara had begun asking the wrong questions about the children's meals and sleeping arrangements. He folded his hands on the table. Clara lives in the village now. She's employed at the Harwick Inn. I think she saw things. You think? I know she saw things. I just don't know if she'll say so, with Prudence threatening her livelihood. Abigail nodded once. She was filing all of it away. Clara Briggs, Gideon Hale, the secondary clause, the pattern of escalation that Samuel had described. She was building something in her head, a shape of the problem, because you couldn't fight something you hadn't fully mapped. And the compass, she said. She went to the table and picked it up. The silver was warm from being near the fire. You recognized it. Nathaniel looked at it with an expression that was complicated and quiet. It was Elias's. He carried it through the entire war. He said his father gave it to him, told him that as long as he knew which way was north, he could find his way home from anywhere. He paused. I gave it to Samuel after the funeral. I thought he should have something of his father's that meant something. He kept it in his coat, Abigail said, through everything. Yes. The word came out rougher than Nathaniel probably intended. She set the compass back on the table between them. All right, she said. Here's what I think we need to do before Prudence arrives. That. She sent Nathaniel to the village, not for the reason he expected, not to find a solicitor of his own or to speak to the constable. She sent him to the Harwick Inn to find Clara Briggs and speak to her before Prudence's people got there first. She gave him specific instructions about what to say, and more importantly, what not to say, because she had a sense that Nathaniel's instinct in uncomfortable conversations was to over-explain and over-apologize in ways that gave the other person too much room to maneuver. Don't tell her what we need from her, Abigail said at the door. Tell her what you know she saw. Tell her you're not going to pretend you didn't know, and that you're going to be held responsible for it whether or not she says anything. Make it clear that her saying something wouldn't be doing you a favor. It would be doing the children one. Nathaniel had looked at her with something that was almost but not quite gratitude. You've thought about people quite a bit, he said. I've had to, Abigail said. I don't have the luxury of assuming they'll behave well without understanding their reasons. He left. She watched him go down the road through the mist, his hat pulled low, his coat still damp from the night's rain, moving with the particular gait of someone who has been given a task they're not sure they're capable of and is going to attempt it anyway. She went back inside and up the ladder to the loft. Samuel had made a kind of arrangement in the loft. He'd pulled the quilt off the bed and wrapped it around both of them, and they were sitting together on the floor against the wall, which Abigail noticed was the furthest point from the ladder down. Samuel looked up when she appeared. His face did the measuring thing again. Mercy, tucked against his side, was awake and watching the space in front of her with the careful inward attention of a child who has learned that the world outside herself is unpredictable and the inside is the only place she can fully control. Is he gone? Samuel asked. For now, he'll be back. Abigail sat on the floor across from them. She had decided, sometime in the last hour, that crouching down to Mercy's level was the right approach, not towering over her, not creating the physical dynamic of adult over child that had apparently been weaponized against her. I want to ask you some things, Samuel, and I want you to tell me if a question is one you can't answer yet. Is that fair? He considered it. Yes, ma'am. The marks on your arm, is that from Mrs. Prudence Whitcomb directly or from someone else in the household? Samuel's jaw moved. Her directly. She keeps a rod in her parlor. She says it's decorative. It isn't. He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Flat, contained, factual. The flatness was doing a lot of work. How many times? Enough that I stopped counting. And Mercy. It wasn't a question. He understood it wasn't a question. She never used the rod on Mercy, he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, like he was deciding in real time how much to say. She had other ways with Mercy. She'd take things. Mercy's doll, that she'd had since she was a baby. Prudence took it and said it was too childish. She took away Mercy's second blanket in winter and said she was coddling her. He stopped, pressed his mouth closed, started again. She'd say things. To Mercy. About our father, that he'd been a foolish man who'd gotten himself killed and left two burdens behind. The room was very quiet. Mercy had not moved, but her hand, lying in her lap, had closed into a small fist. She's wrong about your father, Abigail said, and she said it to Mercy directly and without softening it into something gentler. What I've heard about him tells me he was neither foolish nor careless. He was unlucky. Those aren't the same thing. Mercy's fist stayed closed, but her eyes moved just slightly to Abigail's face. She used to sing, Samuel said. I already told Mr. Whitcomb's friend. He caught himself. I already told you before. You did. What song? Samuel's expression went somewhere softer for just a moment. The face of a boy remembering something he'd kept careful hold of. Our father made it up. Or he said he did. He used to sing it to her when she was small, when she was scared. I don't know all of it, just the beginning. He hesitated. She knows the whole thing. She'd sing it back to him. It was... He stopped again. It was theirs, Abigail said. Yes. Mercy's fist opened. Her fingers spread flat on her knee. Abigail watched the small hand for a moment. Then, Mercy, you don't have to talk. You don't have to do anything right now, but I want you to know something. She waited until the girl's eyes came fully to her face. Whatever, Mrs. Whitcomb told you about yourself, that you were too loud, too much trouble, too childish, too anything. She was telling you those things because small people are easier to manage. Do you understand what I mean? Mercy looked at her. The directness of it was startling, the pure, unblinking attention of a child who was listening with her whole body. She made herself bigger by making you feel smaller, Abigail said. That's all that was. It wasn't true. Samuel made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Abigail rose. Stay up here for now. I need you both to stay quiet and out of sight until I understand what the morning is going to bring. She was halfway down the ladder when she heard it. So faint she almost missed it under the sound of the rain. A melody. 4 notes, 5, repeating. Very soft. Coming from Mercy. Not words. Not yet. But the shape of a song. Abigail kept going down the ladder because stopping and making something of it felt like the wrong move, like opening a door too quickly on something that needed to be allowed to find its own way. She reached the bottom, and above her the melody continued, thin and cautious, feeling its way forward 1 note at a time. She went to the window and watched the road. Nathaniel came back an hour later, and he wasn't alone. Clara Briggs was a heavy-set woman in her 40s with a face that had seen a certain amount of weather and arrived at a kind of settled toughness because of it. She came into Abigail's house with the careful wariness of someone who has been burned before and is not entirely convinced the fire is out. She looked at the room, looked at Abigail, and did a rapid, thorough assessment that reminded Abigail of the way experienced nurses look at a patient, taking inventory before committing to a position. "You're the school teacher," Clara said. "I am." "He says you've got the Reed children." "They're here." Clara looked at Nathaniel, then back at Abigail. "I want to be clear about something before I say anything else. I was dismissed without a character reference. That means I've been trying to find work with a black mark against me for 3 months, because Prudence Whitcomb told anyone who asked that I was dismissed for insolence, and she said it to enough people that it stuck." She folded her hands in front of her. "I'm telling you this not to complain about it, but because I want you to understand that I have a stake in this that is not purely about the children." "I appreciate that," Abigail said. "Sit down." Clara sat. Nathaniel sat. Abigail remained standing because the restlessness in her was making sitting difficult. "What did you see?" Abigail asked. Clara looked at her hands. "I saw the little one locked in the cellar. I was the one who brought her food. What food I was allowed to bring, which wasn't much. I saw the boy's arms. I heard Mrs. Whitcomb speak to those children in ways that I—" She stopped, set her jaw. "I have 6 children of my own. Grown now, but I raised them. And I know the difference between discipline and what she was doing. Will you say that to a justice of the peace?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "What happens to me if I do?" "I don't know," Abigail said honestly. "I can't promise you that Prudence Whitcomb won't make your life difficult. She probably will. But I can tell you that if the truth comes out fully, her ability to damage anyone else is going to be considerably reduced." She paused. "And I can tell you that those children need someone who saw what happened to say that they saw it. Samuel will speak for himself. But he's 10 years old, and a 10-year-old's testimony is easier to dismiss than a woman's who was present in the household." Clara was quiet for a longer moment this time. She was looking past Abigail at the ladder to the loft, as if she could see through it to the children above. "The little one," she said. "Mercy. When I first came to the house, she used to come into the kitchen. She'd sit on the flour barrel and watch me knead bread and talk. Lord, that child could talk." Something in Clara's face softened and then firmed back up. "By the time I left, she hadn't said a word in 6 weeks. She's beginning to sing again," Abigail said quietly. Clara looked at her. Her eyes were bright and sharp. "Is she?" "Upstairs, right now." Something moved across Clara's face that was difficult to name. Relief and grief, and a kind of anger that had been waiting somewhere and had just found its justification. "Yes," Clara said. "I'll say what I saw." They were still talking through the details. What Clara had witnessed and when, what records, if any, existed, whether the other servants who had remained in the Whitcomb house might be reachable, when the sound came from outside. Not a knock. A carriage. Abigail went to the window. The carriage was the Whitcomb carriage, black and well-maintained, coming up the road at a pace that was not hurried but was absolutely deliberate. Behind it, on horseback, was a second man she didn't recognize. He was younger, dressed in town clothes, carrying a leather satchel. That would be Gideon Hale, she supposed. "She's here," Abigail said. Nathaniel stood up. She could see something happening in him. The old pattern trying to reassert itself, the long-trained instinct to accommodate, to find a way to soften the conflict before it hardened. She watched him fight it. "Clara," Abigail said, without taking her eyes off the carriage. "Take the ladder to the loft. Stay up there with the children. Don't let them come down, and don't let any sound carry if you can help it." She glanced at Nathaniel. "You, stand behind me and to my left, not beside me, behind me. If she's going to negotiate, let her negotiate with me first." "You want me behind you," Nathaniel said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite objection, but wasn't quite compliance either. "I want her to underestimate what she's walking into," Abigail said. "She's expecting a single woman she can steamroll. Let her keep expecting that for as long as possible." He held her gaze for a moment. "You've done this before." "Not this exactly, but something like it." She went to the wall, took down the musket, and propped it visibly against the doorframe where anyone entering would see it, but no one could reasonably claim it was being pointed at them. "Something exactly like it would be better, but you work with what you have. The carriage stopped in front of the house. The man with the leather satchel dismounted first and went to the carriage door. The woman who stepped out was not what Abigail had been picturing. She'd been picturing an older woman, yes, but older in the way of someone diminished by age, smaller, slower. Prudence Whitcomb was not smaller. She was thin in the particular way of very controlled people, dressed in severe gray wool that probably cost more than Abigail's entire wardrobe, and she moved across the wet ground to the front door with the unhurried precision of a woman who had never in her life rushed toward anything because she understood that things came to her eventually. She looked at the musket against the door frame before she looked at Abigail. "Miss Hartwell," she said. Her voice was perfectly calibrated, not loud, not soft, the kind of voice that assumed it would be heard without effort. "My name is Prudence Whitcomb. I believe you have something of mine." Abigail looked at her steadily. "I have 2 children in my house who came to me in a storm, cold and frightened. I don't believe children belong to anyone." Prudence's expression didn't change. It was a very accomplished expression, the kind that had been practiced over many decades into something nearly impervious. "How poetic. This is Mr. Hale, my solicitor. He has documents that establish my legal authority over the Reed children, granted by their appointed guardian." She glanced past Abigail into the room. Her eyes found Nathaniel. Something in them cooled by a degree. "Nathaniel, you look terrible." "Aunt Prudence," he said. His voice was flat. "Come home. We can discuss the rest of this in a civilized setting." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. A pause. It was a very small pause, but Abigail caught the slight recalibration behind Prudence's composed face, the adjustment for an unexpected variable. "Mr. Hale," Prudence said pleasantly, "would you please read the relevant section of the guardianship document?" Hale opened his satchel with practiced efficiency and produced several folded papers. He was younger than Abigail had expected, mid-30s, competent-looking, with the careful blankness of a man who has learned not to let his personal opinions show up in his professional expression. The document grants Mrs. Prudence Whitcomb authority to act as co-guardian of Samuel Reed, age 10, and Mercy Reed, age 6, in matters of their care, residence, and well-being, in cases where— "Mr. Hale," Abigail said. He stopped, looked at her. "I've heard the argument about the document," she said. "Mr. Whitcomb has explained it to me. What I'd like you to explain, to me, and perhaps later to a justice of the peace, is whether that document also grants Mrs. Whitcomb the authority to lock a 6-year-old child in a cellar for 3 days, or to strike a 10-year-old boy with a rod on multiple occasions." She kept her voice even, "because if it does, I'd very much like to see the specific language." Hale's professional blankness held, but something moved behind it. He glanced at Prudence. Prudence had not moved, but the temperature around her had changed in some way that was difficult to point to but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. "You have no proof of those allegations," she said. "I have witnesses," Abigail said. "More than one." Another pause. Longer this time. "This is a matter for the courts," Prudence said, "not for a schoolteacher's doorstep." "I agree," Abigail said. "Entirely. Let's bring it to the courts then. Bring your document. I'll bring my witnesses. We'll see which the justice of the peace finds more persuasive, paperwork or people who were present." Prudence looked at her with an expression that had finally dropped the pleasantness and revealed the thing underneath it, which was not anger exactly, but a cold and total confidence in her own eventual victory. It was the expression of someone who had won so many small battles over so many years that she had stopped being able to fully imagine losing one. "You're going to regret this, Miss Hartwell," she said. Quiet. Certain. "Your position in this township is not as secure as you seem to believe." "Probably not," Abigail said. "Most positions aren't." Prudence held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned, said something low to Hale, and walked back to her carriage with the same unhurried precision she'd arrived with. Hale followed. The carriage turned in the road and moved away. Abigail stood in the doorway until it was out of sight. Then she let out a slow breath and went back inside. Nathaniel was standing exactly where she'd left him, behind her and to her left. He was looking at the space the carriage had occupied. "She'll be at the township council by this afternoon," he said. "I know." Abigail set the musket back against the wall. Her hands were steadier than she felt, which was a useful quality and one she'd worked to develop. Then we have until this afternoon. From above, through the ceiling, came the sound of Mercy's song again, clearer now. More notes than before. Still no words, but the melody was fuller, more confident, as if it had found more room to breathe. Nathaniel heard it. He went very still. "She hasn't sung since January," he said. The words came out unsteady in a way that everything else he'd said had not. "I know," Abigail said. He stood there listening, and she stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while, because the song above them was doing something that words were not equipped to do, and interrupting it with words seemed like a waste. Eventually Abigail moved to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat down with the paper and pen she kept by the window. "We're going to write down everything," she said. "Dates, incidents, names, Clara's account, and Samuel's account separately, so there's no question of them being coached from the same source." She dipped the pen. "And then we're going to figure out who on the township council still remembers what a fair hearing looks like." Nathaniel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't look like a man who was going to give ground anymore. He looked like a man who had finally, at some cost to himself, found the thing worth not giving ground over. "Tell me where to start," he said. Abigail set the pen to the paper. "Start with the night you found out about the cellar," she said. "Every detail you can remember. The time, what she told you, what you saw on Mercy's hands, all of it." He started to talk. She started to write. Above them, faint and steady, the song continued. 4 notes that had survived 8 months of being silenced, finding their way back into the air one careful breath at a time. Outside, the mist had begun to clear. It was going to be a hard afternoon. But the morning was still theirs, and they were using every minute of it. The township council met on the 2nd floor of the Harwick Inn, in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood and the particular staleness of decisions that had been made in it for 30 years. There were 5 council members. Abigail knew all of them by name and by the faces of their children, which was, she had long understood, a different kind of knowing than the kind they extended to her. She had been before this council twice in 4 years. Once when she'd first applied for the teaching position, and once when a parent had complained that she'd assigned a reading text he considered inappropriate for children. It was a pamphlet on civic responsibility, which apparently qualified. Both times she had sat across the table from these 5 men and made her case with the knowledge that she was working with a narrower margin for error than any man in her position would have been allowed. Today was different from both of those times, and not only because the stakes were higher. She arrived with Nathaniel beside her and Clara Briggs behind, and she carried the written accounts she and Nathaniel had spent the morning producing. 4 pages in her own hand, precise and dated, documenting every incident Samuel had described and every incident Clara could corroborate. She had also, on a separate sheet, written out the language of the secondary guardianship clause as Nathaniel had dictated it from memory, with 3 specific questions written underneath it that she intended to put to Gideon Hale in front of witnesses. The children were not with her. She had left them at the house with the bolt drawn, with instructions to Samuel that she hoped he wouldn't need. Prudence was already there when they arrived. She was seated at the far end of the council table in a chair she had apparently requested from a different room. It was taller than the others, a detail so perfectly calibrated that Abigail had to work not to show that she'd noticed it. Gideon Hale sat to her left with his satchel open and documents fanned before him with the organized neatness of a man who had done this many times. 3 of the 5 council members were already seated. The other 2 arrived within minutes. One of them, Edmund Ferris, who ran the grain mill and whose twin daughters Abigail had taught last year, glancing at her with an expression that was not hostile but was working hard at neutral. The council chairman was a man named Josiah Webb, 60 years old, deliberate in everything he did, who had been managing town disputes for 2 decades with the steady, somewhat exhausted fairness of someone who had long since stopped believing that either side of any argument was entirely right. "We're here on a matter of guardianship and conduct," Webb said, when everyone was settled. He looked at Abigail, then at Prudence, with equal flatness. "Mrs. Whitcomb has brought a complaint regarding the unauthorized removal of 2 children under her legal authority. Miss Hartwell, I understand you have a response to that complaint. I have several responses, Abigail said. I'd like to begin with a question, if the council will permit it. Webb nodded once. The complaint describes the children as having been under Mrs. Whitcomb's legal authority. She set the written account on the table in front of her. I'd like Mr. Hale to confirm, for the council's record, whether the legal authority he's referencing is primary guardianship, which belongs to Mr. Nathaniel Whitcomb, who is present today, or the secondary clause that Mrs. Whitcomb had inserted into the guardianship document without Mr. Whitcomb's full understanding of its implications. A small silence. Hale's professional composure held, but his eyes moved to Prudence with an involuntary quickness that was itself a kind of answer. The document was reviewed and signed by Mr. Whitcomb, Hale said. Reviewed, Nathaniel said from beside Abigail. His voice was quiet and even. I signed a stack of household documents that morning. My aunt brought them to me while I was working on accounts. I did not read the secondary clause. I was not told that it was drafted by your office rather than by the solicitor who handled Captain Reed's original arrangements. He looked at Hale steadily. I'm not saying you fabricated it. I'm saying it was presented to me in a way that obscured what it actually did. Hale opened his mouth, closed it. A man who had planned for most of the arguments that might come at him, and had not fully planned for the principal party, simply admitting his own negligence and then explaining why it didn't mean what Prudence needed it to mean. Prudence, across the table, had not moved, but the quality of her stillness had changed. It had gone from the settled stillness of a woman who has done this before and is comfortable with the process, to the held stillness of a woman exerting considerable effort to maintain her composure. The document is valid, she said. Not to Nathaniel, to Webb. Whatever Mr. Whitcomb's private recollections about the morning he signed it, it bears his signature, it was witnessed, and it establishes my authority clearly. The question before this council isn't the document. It's whether a school teacher with no legal standing chose to harbor two children against the wishes of their lawful guardian, and what the appropriate consequence of that choice should be. She said it beautifully. Abigail had to acknowledge that. The logic was clean, the framing was confident, and the slight emphasis on school teacher and no legal standing was placed with the precision of someone who understood that a woman's credibility in a room like this was not a given, but a thing that had to be established or undermined before anything else. If I could speak to the question of why the children came to my door, Abigail said, and she did not wait for Webb's nod this time, because waiting was the wrong move. I'd like to present a written account of the circumstances compiled this morning from two separate sources. She slid the papers to Webb. He picked them up and read the first page without expression. She watched Edmund Ferris, with the twin daughters, lean slightly sideways to read over Webb's shoulder. Mrs. Whitcomb, Webb said when he'd read it. This account describes a number of specific incidents of mistreatment. Do you wish to respond to them? Prudence had not read the account. She didn't need to. She already knew what was in it. I wish to say that the discipline of children in a well-run household is not mistreatment, and that the characterization of normal corrective measures as abuse is precisely what one would expect from, she paused, an interested party with a reason to discredit me. The cellar, said Edmund Ferris suddenly. Prudence turned her head toward him with the slow precision of a woman who is unaccustomed to being interrupted. The account says the girl, the 6-year-old, was locked in a cellar for 3 days, Ferris said. He was looking at the paper, not at Prudence, and his voice had a careful, deliberate quality that meant he was choosing each word before he set it down. I've got daughters that age. I'd like to hear your response to that specific incident. Children require structure, Prudence said. The girl knocked over a candle holder and nearly caused a fire. A cellar, Ferris said, for 3 days. Order requires consistency. Mr. Ferris has asked a specific question, Abigail said. The question is whether a 6-year-old child was confined to a cellar for 3 days as punishment for knocking over a candle holder. I have a witness who can answer it. Your witnesses are a dismissed servant with a grievance and a man who has already admitted he wasn't paying proper attention to his own household, Prudence said, still composed, still certain. The council will weigh that accordingly. My witnesses, Abigail said, are those two, yes, and also Samuel Reed, who is 10 years old and was present for every incident described in that account. She paused. He would like to speak to this council, if the council is willing to hear him." The room shifted. She could feel it. Not a dramatic shift, not the kind you could point to and describe. Just a change in the quality of the attention, the way attention changes when something unexpected has been offered and people are deciding how to respond to it. Webb looked at Prudence, then at Abigail. "The boy is here?" "He will be, if you're willing to hear him." Another pause. Prudence spoke into it, and for the first time there was something in her voice that was not quite composure, not quite anything Abigail could name yet, but different from what had been there before. Bringing a grieving child before a council to perform testimony is precisely the kind of manipulation that should disqualify Miss Hartwell from her position entirely. "She's using a child." "Nobody is using him," Nathaniel said. His voice was still quiet, but there was something in it that Abigail recognized. The particular tone of a man who has just crossed a line he's been standing at for a long time and is surprised to find the ground on the other side solid. He asked to speak. "Last night. He told Miss Hartwell he had things to say, and he wanted to say them somewhere that mattered." He looked at his aunt for the first time since sitting down, and what was in his expression was not anger, which would have been easier for Prudence to manage. It was something more like sorrow. "He's 10 years old, and he's been keeping this catalog in his head for 8 months, because he understood that the only protection his sister had was him. The least this council can do is listen." The room was very quiet. Webb said, "Send for the boy." Abigail went herself. She walked the half-mile back to her house at a pace that wanted to be faster than it was, because running through the village would have looked like panic, and she couldn't afford panic right now, not in how she looked and not in what she felt. She had left the children with clear instructions, but instructions given to a 10-year-old in a crisis were not the same as instructions followed. When she unbolted the door and came in, she found Samuel exactly where she'd told him to be. At the table, the compass in front of him, sitting upright. Clara was gone. Mercy was on the bench by the fire, not asleep, watching the coals with the focused inward attention that was becoming familiar. "They want to hear you," Abigail told Samuel. He looked at her. His expression was doing the complicated thing again, measuring something, running a calculation. "Will it help?" he asked. "I think it might be the thing that decides it," she said honestly, "but I won't tell you it's without risk. Prudence is going to be there. She may say things while you're speaking that are designed to make you feel like what you're saying isn't being believed. The council may ask you things you don't expect, and you can stop at any point, for any reason, and I will take you home, and we will figure out a different way." He was quiet for a moment. "What if there isn't a different way?" "Then we'll find the next closest thing. But Samuel," she sat across from him, same as she had in the loft that morning, on his level. "You've been carrying this by yourself for 8 months. You don't have to carry it alone today." His throat moved. He looked down at the compass. "My father said—" He stopped, picked the compass up, held it in his palm. "He said that the brave thing and the right thing aren't always the same thing. He said you have to know the difference, or you'll spend your whole life doing things that feel brave but aren't right." He turned the compass over. "I think telling the truth to people who might actually do something about it is both things." "I think so too," Abigail said. He closed his hand around the compass and stood up. They looked at Mercy, who was watching them both from the bench. "I'll be back," Samuel told her, "before dark." Mercy looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes. Then she looked at Abigail. Then she made a sound, 2 syllables, quiet, barely there, like testing whether they would stay in the air. It took Abigail a half-second to understand she was hearing a word. The word was careful. Samuel's face did something that was almost a smile. Not a happy one, but the kind that comes from being surprised by something you've been missing. "I will," he said. Titch sat. The walk back to the inn was not long, but it felt long in the way that walks feel long when you are accompanying someone towards something difficult. Samuel walked beside her with his hands at his sides and the compass in his right pocket, and the particular posture of a child who is making a conscious decision to hold himself upright. They reached the inn. They went up the stairs. Abigail opened the door to the council room and Samuel walked in ahead of her. Prudence, at the far end of the table, looked at the boy with an expression that was managing itself very carefully. If there was anything underneath the careful management, it was not readable. Samuel looked at her. He looked at her for exactly long enough to let her know he wasn't afraid of looking at her, and then he looked at Webb. "Sit down, son," Webb said, not unkindly. Samuel sat. He set his hands flat on the table, same as he had on Abigail's table that morning. Same posture, the posture of someone who has decided that stillness is the most honest way to show up. "We'd like to hear what you know," Webb said, "about your time in the Whitcomb household, in your own words." "Yes, sir." Samuel looked at the table for a moment, organizing. Then he began. He did not dramatize it. That was the thing that Abigail watched the council respond to. He told it the way you'd tell someone how to get from one place to another, step by step, with the specific details of a person who had been paying careful attention because he'd understood that the details might matter someday. Dates, when he knew them. Descriptions. The rod that Prudence kept in the parlor. The cellar. The meals that came late or not at all. The words she'd said about their father. He repeated these carefully, with quotation marks you could hear, because he understood the difference between summarizing and reporting. He talked for nearly 20 minutes. The room did not fidget. When he finished, there was a silence. Webb said, "Thank you, Samuel." Then Prudence said, "May I speak?" It was not a question. Webb nodded. "What this boy has described," Prudence said, and her voice was still controlled, still precisely calibrated, but Abigail could hear now that the control was costing something. There was a brittleness in it that hadn't been there an hour ago. Is the selective recollection of a child who has been coached and guided by a woman with an obvious interest in discrediting me. The incidents he describes are mischaracterized. Discipline is not abuse. Order is not cruelty. And the fact that a grieving child found our household difficult does not make it the cellar, Ferris said again. He had apparently decided that this was the hill. "I have already addressed the cellar. You said order requires consistency," Ferris said. "My question is whether your understanding of consistent order includes locking a child of 6 in a dark room underground for 3 days. Yes or no?" Prudence looked at him. Something in her face had gone through a transformation that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The composed surface was holding, but the confidence underneath it, the deep bone-level certainty that had been there since she arrived, had shifted. Not collapsed, but shifted. "The child was not harmed," she said. "That's not what I asked," Ferris said. Another silence, different in texture from the ones before. Nathaniel, who had been sitting quietly through Samuel's testimony, with his face doing what faces do when you're hearing things you already knew but didn't fully let yourself know, spoke without looking up. "She can't answer yes because yes is damning, and she can't answer no because Samuel and Claire and I all know the answer is yes." He looked up. "Josiah, I want to formally withdraw my consent to the secondary clause of the guardianship document. I understand that has legal implications that will need to be sorted out in a proper court, but I want it stated for this council's record that I do not acknowledge Prudence Whitcomb as holding any authority over these children." Hale leaned toward Prudence and said something quietly. She listened. Her expression did not change. Her hands, in her lap, were not visible, but Abigail was fairly certain from the set of her shoulders that they were not relaxed. "That withdrawal is not legally effective without a court order," Hale said. "I understand that," Nathaniel said. "I said I want it on the record, for when we get to court." Webb was looking at his hands. He was a man who had seen a lot of disputes, and Abigail watched him doing the private calculation of someone assessing which way the ground was sloping. He was not a bad man. He was a careful one, which was a different thing. And careful men sometimes got to the right place by a longer route than you'd wish they would. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "you had a third witness, Mrs. Briggs, was it?" "Clara Briggs, yes. She was employed in the Whitcomb household until 3 months ago." "Is she prepared to speak before this council?" "She is." Webb looked at Prudence. "We'll hear her, and then we'll deliberate." Prudence said nothing. She turned and looked at the window instead. And in profile, her face was still composed, still precise. and Abigail studied it the way you study a thing you're trying to understand before it moves. Clara was waiting downstairs. She came up without hesitation, sat in the chair Samuel had vacated, and spoke with the blunt, specific clarity of a woman who had been holding on to something heavy for 3 months and had finally decided to set it down. She described the cellar. She described the meals she had been permitted to bring, what she was told to bring, and what she brought extra of when she thought she wouldn't be observed, folded inside a cloth so it would not be seen. She described a morning in June when she had gone to Mercy's room to wake her for breakfast and found the girl sitting on the floor instead of the bed, because at some point Prudence had decided that Mercy did not deserve the bed until she demonstrated adequate behavior, and the floor was where Mercy had slept for 2 weeks before Clara realized what was happening and told Nathaniel, who had spoken to Prudence, who had reversed the decision while Clara was still in the house, and reinstated it within a week of Clara's dismissal. This last detail landed in the room with a particular weight. "How do you know it was reinstated after your dismissal?" Webb asked. "Because Thomas Greer, one of the stable hands who was still employed there at the time, told me when I ran into him at the market in August. He'd seen it himself." Clara folded her hands. "I can give you his name and where to find him if you want to ask him directly." Webb wrote the name down. He wrote it down carefully, and that careful writing was itself a kind of statement. Prudence stood up. It was a smooth motion, controlled, and she gathered herself as she rose with the composure of someone who has decided that composure is the only remaining available position. "Josiah," she said, "I have been a member of this county's community for 60 years. My family's name has been connected to this region since before most of the people in this room were born. I have considerable respect for this council's process, and I understand that there are concerns here that need to be addressed through proper legal channels. But what I am not going to do is sit in this room and be treated as a defendant by a school teacher who took it upon herself to intervene in matters that are none of her legal concern." She looked at Abigail directly. "You have overreached, Miss Hartwell, and whatever temporary drama you have manufactured here today, there will be consequences." "There already are consequences," Abigail said. "The question is who they fall on." Prudence held her gaze for 3 seconds, which was the same number as that morning in the doorway, and Abigail thought that was probably how long it took Prudence to register that a thing wasn't going the way she'd intended. Then Prudence looked at Webb. "I'll see you in court, Josiah. Proper court, where these matters will be settled correctly." She walked out. Hale followed, gathering his documents with efficient speed. The room was very quiet for a moment. Samuel was still sitting at the far end of the table. He had watched the whole of it without moving, with the compass tight in his right hand. His face was unreadable in the way of someone who has burned through most of what they had, and is holding very still so nobody can see how much. Webb looked at him, then at Abigail, then at Nathaniel. "This council can't rule on the guardianship itself," he said. "That's for the county court, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I can say for the record that the complaint against Miss Hartwell, the allegation of improper conduct in taking in the children, is, in my view, without merit. A woman who opens her door to 2 children in a storm is not guilty of improper conduct." He paused. "That's my position, and I believe my colleagues will agree with it." Ferris was already nodding. 2 of the other men nodded with him. The 5th, an older man named Cutter, who had not said a single word through the entire proceeding, looked at the table and then gave a single nod, slow and private, like something he was mostly saying to himself. Abigail breathed. "The court case," Nathaniel said to Webb. "How long before it can be scheduled?" 2 weeks, at minimum. Could be longer, depending on the judge's calendar. 2 weeks. Abigail turned it over. It was not nothing. It was not everything. "The children can stay with me," she said. "In the meantime—" "That'll need to be formally arranged," Webb said. "Arrange it." He looked at her, something in his expression that was somewhere between amusement and respect, in the complicated proportion of a man who hadn't expected this morning to go this way. "I'll send someone to the county offices this afternoon." They came out of the inn into a village that had not changed and somehow felt different. The same mud on the road, the same smell of wood smoke and river, the same faces moving between the same buildings. But several of those faces had turned toward the inn's door when they came through it, and several of them were people Abigail recognized, which meant that word had gotten around in the way Word always got around in a small town when something was happening that people hadn't been invited to watch directly. Nathaniel stopped on the steps. He looked across the road to where Prudence's carriage was still visible, moving away at the northern end of the high street. "She'll come at the school," he said. "Whatever Webb said about the complaint, she's going to go directly to the council members individually. She'll make it about propriety and community standards and the kind of woman who should be trusted with children." "I know," Abigail said. "She has money, and money talks to certain people in ways that council meetings don't." "I know that too." He looked at her. "You don't seem worried enough." "I'm worried," she said. "I just don't show it the same way." She started down the steps. "Worry doesn't improve the situation. Preparation does. We have 2 weeks to prepare, and I intend to use them." Samuel fell into step beside her as they crossed the road. He hadn't said much since his testimony. He was somewhere inside himself, processing something, and Abigail had learned enough about him in the space of a single day to know that this was what he did with large things. He took them inside, examined them quietly, and came back out when he'd figured out what they meant. Halfway down the road, he said, "She said I was coached." "She did." "Was I?" Abigail looked at him sideways. "Did I tell you what to say?" He thought about it. "No?" "Then you weren't coached. You were given a place to say what you already knew." He thought about this for another half block. "She said I was being used." "Yes." "Is that true?" She stopped walking. He stopped beside her, and Nathaniel stopped a half step behind, and she looked at the boy with the full attention she'd been giving him since the moment she'd opened her door. "Samuel, the only person in that room who was trying to use you was the one who called you a coached witness. Using you would have meant telling you what to say, or keeping you from saying something that complicated the situation, or making decisions about your testimony based on what it did for my case rather than what it did for yours." She held his gaze. "I would have let you stop at any moment. I would have taken you home if you'd asked. What you said in there was yours. It came from you. Nobody used it except you." He looked at her for a long moment. The compression around his eyes, the one that had been there since she'd first opened her door to him, loosened by a single degree. "Okay," he said. "Just that." They walked the rest of the way home. When they came through the door, Mercy was sitting at the table instead of the bench by the fire. She had found Abigail's pen and paper and had done something with them that it took Abigail a moment to understand. She had drawn a series of small, careful marks across the paper, and after another moment, Abigail realized they were musical notes, or her approximation of them, copied imperfectly from a page of music she must have found in the stack by the window. Samuel looked at the paper. He looked at Mercy. "Is that Father's song?" he asked. Mercy looked at the paper, then at him. Then, with the small, deliberate precision of someone who has been thinking about something for a while and has decided to commit to it, she opened her mouth and sang the first 4 notes clearly, without hesitation, with a confidence that had not been there that morning. They were not perfect notes. Her voice was a 6-year-old's voice, a little rough at the edges, a little uncertain of its own register. But they were there, present in the room, taking up space. Samuel sat down across from her. His throat moved. "Keep going," he said. She did. Nathaniel stood in the doorway with his hand still on the door, and Abigail stood beside him. And neither of them moved, because the song in the room was doing something that mattered, and the walls were already close enough. Outside, the afternoon light had come out clean and cold after the morning's mist. The kind of light that makes everything look sharper than you're used to. Every edge more defined, every color slightly more itself. It was the kind of day, Abigail thought, that didn't care what had happened in the morning. It just offered itself, fully lit, and let you decide what to do with it. The 2 weeks ahead were going to be hard. Prudence would not stop. The court case would be expensive and exhausting, and there was no guarantee it would go the way it needed to go. The township council's absolution of her conduct was something, but it was not everything, and she knew better than to mistake the beginning of a battle for its end. But in this moment, in this room, a girl who had not spoken for weeks was singing her father's song at a kitchen table, and her brother was listening with his whole body. And that was a fact that existed now and could not be made to unexist no matter what Prudence Whitcomb took to court. Abigail turned from the door and went to put the kettle on. The 2 weeks before the court date were not quiet ones. Prudence moved the way Abigail had expected her to. Not dramatically, not with open confrontation after the council meeting, but with the patient, methodical pressure of someone who understood that sustained force applied in the right places was more effective than a single blow. She visited Edmund Ferris at his mill on a Tuesday, ostensibly to discuss a grain order for the Whitcomb household. She was seen having tea with the wife of the council's oldest member on a Thursday afternoon. She sent a letter to the county's district overseer of education, which Abigail learned about not because anyone told her directly, but because the overseer's clerk was cousin to one of her students' mothers, and small towns ran on exactly that kind of connection, whether anyone admitted it or not. The letter, as reported through this chain, questioned Abigail's moral fitness to operate a school attached to a private residence, raised concerns about the safety of children in her care, given that she had, without authorization, taken in 2 unknown minors overnight, and asked whether the district had clear protocols for situations of this nature. It was beautifully written in that it never said anything directly accusatory. It arranged facts into a shape that implied accusation without providing a surface to push back against. Abigail read the letter, or the account of it, sitting at her kitchen table while Samuel did his reading at the other end, and Mercy drew something elaborate in the margins of a piece of paper Abigail had given her specifically so she would stop drawing in the margins of everything else. "She's careful," Abigail said, mostly to herself. "She's always been careful," Nathaniel said. He was at the window, which had become his position of choice in the evenings when he came from the Whitcomb house. He'd been staying there alone, had dismissed the remaining staff temporarily, and was overseeing the place in a stripped-down, uncomfortable way that seemed to Abigail like an appropriate penance, though she hadn't said that to him. "My father used to say she never fought directly because direct fights could be won against her. She preferred the kind where you couldn't quite find the battlefield." "We need to find Gideon Hale's battlefield, then," Abigail said. Nathaniel looked at her. "He drafted that secondary clause," she said. "He brought it to you mixed in with ordinary household papers. Whether Prudence instructed him to do it that way, or whether it was his own initiative doesn't matter. What matters is that a solicitor obscured the nature of a legal document from the person who signed it. That's not a minor thing, depending on who's looking at it." "You're thinking about the judge." "I'm thinking about what the judge will see when he looks at this case. He'll see a wealthy widow with 60 years of county history and good legal representation on one side. On the other side, he'll see a school teacher, 2 children, and a man who admits he didn't read what he signed." She tapped the table. "The one thing that changes that picture is if we can establish that the document was presented deceptively, because then the issue isn't Nathaniel's negligence. The issue is Hale's conduct." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Hale has a reputation to protect." "That's exactly right." He understood what she was saying. She could see it arrive in his face, not as a plan fully formed, but as the beginning of a plan, which was what she had. "I need to speak to him directly, before the hearing, not as Prudence's adversary, as the man who signed the documents. You need to make him understand that you intend to describe exactly how those papers were presented to you, in open court, in front of a judge who will then have an opinion about it." She looked at him carefully. "You're not threatening him. You're informing him. There's a difference, and you need to hold that line precisely. You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," she said, "but you know him better than I do, and you know what he's afraid of losing. Use that." He left early the next morning to find Hale at his offices in Yonkers. She spent that day doing what she'd been doing every day. Teaching in the morning, because whatever else was happening, the school had not closed, and the children had not stopped needing to learn things, and the normalcy of it was, she suspected, doing more for Samuel and Mercy than most of the other things she could offer them. Samuel had started sitting in on the morning sessions, not as a student exactly, but as a presence at the back of the room, working through problems she set him that were above the level of the township's other students. He was quick, and he was thorough, and watching him work through a problem was like watching someone remember something they'd known before they'd had reason to be afraid. Mercy did not sit in on the lessons. She was not ready for a room full of other children yet, but she had started coming into the schoolroom after the other students left, when it was just her and Samuel and Abigail, and she would sit at one of the smaller desks and do the drawing she did endlessly, figures, scenes, things Abigail couldn't always interpret, but that clearly meant something to the girl producing them. That afternoon, Mercy brought one of the drawings to Abigail and set it on the table in front of her without preamble. It was a house, not the Whitcomb house. Something smaller, lower, with what looked like a garden on one side. In front of the house were 3 figures of varying heights, and in the doorway was a 4th figure, a woman, with what appeared to be a long-barreled object propped against the frame beside her. Abigail looked at it for a moment, then at Mercy. "Is that my house?" she asked. Mercy looked at the drawing. Then she nodded, once, with the gravity of a child who has been asked a serious question and intends to answer it seriously. "And the people in front?" Mercy pointed to the tallest figure, then to the medium figure, then to the smallest. Samuel, Nathaniel, herself. Abigail looked at the 4th figure in the doorway. "And that one?" Mercy looked at her with those dark eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, 2 syllables. "You." It was the most she'd said in a single exchange since arriving. Abigail kept her face level because she'd learned that Mercy needed things received evenly, without the kind of emphatic response that would make the child feel scrutinized. "It's a good house," Abigail said, and slid the drawing back across the table. "You should keep it." Mercy took it back. She folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of the dress, one of Abigail's old ones, taken in and hemmed by Abigail's own rough hand, and went back to the schoolroom. Nathaniel came back from Yonkers late that evening, looking like a man who had done something uncomfortable and was not yet sure whether it had worked. He sat down at the table and accepted the cup Abigail set in front of him, and was quiet for long enough that she went back to what she'd been doing and waited for him to come to it. "I told him what I intended to say in court," he finally said. "About the presentation of the documents. I was specific. I told him which morning it was, who else was in the room, what other papers were in the stack, what he said to me when he handed them over." He wrapped both hands around the cup. He listened. He didn't interrupt, which is unusual for him. When I finished, he asked me if there was anything that would change my recollection of events. "And what did you say?" I said my recollection was what it was, and that I intended to share it fully with the court. He paused. He asked me what outcome I was hoping for. I told him I was hoping that the court would have an accurate understanding of how the secondary clause came to exist and what weight it should be given. He looked at the table. He said he would need to speak with his client. Abigail sat down across from him. "That's movement." "It might be. Or it might be him buying time to prepare a counter-argument." "It might be both." She considered it. "He's a careful man. He will have known when he drafted that clause that its presentation was questionable. Professional men who know something is questionable don't like having it examined in open court. They like it even less when the person doing the examining is the one who has the clearest account of events." He asked me if Prudence knew I was coming to see him. "What did you say?" Nathaniel's mouth moved. I said probably not, but that she'd find out. I told him that the gap between what Prudence wanted from this situation and what was going to be good for his professional standing in the long run was something worth thinking about. Abigail looked at him. "You've gotten better at this." He looked up. Something in his expression was uncertain, not about the visit, but about the observation. Like he wasn't sure whether better at this was a thing he should accept as a compliment about himself or a description of what necessity had pushed him into. "I've had a good teacher," he said, and he said it without any particular inflection, like a simple fact. The heat of it was unexpected. Abigail felt it somewhere in the center of her chest, that particular warmth of being seen clearly by someone you'd thought was only seeing the surface of things. And she turned her attention back to the papers on the table because the timing was entirely wrong for what that warmth wanted to turn into. "We still need Thomas Greer," she said, "the stable hand. If he'll testify about Mercy's sleeping arrangements being reinstated after Clara left, that closes the gap in the timeline. I'll find him tomorrow, and we need to be prepared for the judge to question why it took 8 months for anyone to act on this. That question is going to come, and it's going to be directed at you, and you need to answer it without deflecting." Nathaniel was quiet. "I know. You know, but I want you to actually think about how you're going to answer it. Not the version you want to give. The true version. Because the true version is the only one that holds up." He turned the cup in his hands. "The true version is that I was a man who'd inherited more than he knew what to do with. including his own tendency to give ground to people who pushed hard enough, and he told himself it was manageable when it wasn't, because that was easier than admitting he'd made a catastrophic error of judgment in accepting those children into a household he hadn't secured for them. He set the cup down. The true version is that I failed 2 children who had already lost the one person they trusted. And I did it by not paying attention, which is possibly the most useless way there is to fail someone. The room was quiet. That's the version, Abigail said. Say it exactly like that. He looked at her. Exactly like that? The judge isn't looking for a man who has the right answer. He's looking for a man who understands what he did wrong. There's a difference. One of them is constructed. The other one is what you just said. She held his gaze. Say it exactly like that. Quote, the court hearing was on a Thursday, 16 days after the storm. The courtroom was on the ground floor of the county building in Yonkers. A functional room, not impressive, with benches along the walls and a raised desk for the judge, and a smell of old paper and the kind of institutional cold that good fires couldn't entirely defeat. Judge Harold Crane was 70 years old, white-haired, and had the face of a man who had been lied to so many times in this room that he developed a particular sensitivity to the texture of lies, the way some people developed a sensitivity to changes in the weather. He had presided over the county's civil court for 22 years. Abigail had researched him the same way she'd researched everything else, through the network of connections that a school teacher in a small town could access if she was thorough enough about it. And what she'd found was that he was neither corrupt nor especially sympathetic, but that he had a documented tendency to rule against parties who appeared to be acting in bad faith, even when their legal position was technically stronger than their opponents. That was what she was counting on. It wasn't much, but you work with what you have. Prudence arrived with Hale and 2 other men Abigail didn't recognize. She was dressed differently than she'd been at the council meeting, still severe, still expensive, but with a slightly more subdued quality, as if someone had counseled her that the full display of social authority might not play well before a judge who had seen all of it before. Abigail arrived with Nathaniel, Clara Briggs, Thomas Greer, who had agreed to testify after Nathaniel spent 2 hours convincing him that Prudence's ability to affect his livelihood was considerably reduced if she lost this case, and the children. She had debated whether to bring the children. She had gone back and forth on it for 3 days. In the end, she'd decided that they needed to be present, not because they would be required to speak, but because their presence was itself a kind of statement, and because leaving them home meant leaving them alone, and she wasn't going to do that. Samuel sat between her and Nathaniel on the bench. Mercy sat on Samuel's other side, close enough to be touching his arm, and she spent most of the preliminary proceedings looking at the floor in front of her with a focused attention that Abigail recognized as the way Mercy processed new environments, cataloging them, making them known to herself, reducing the unknown to a manageable quantity. Hale presented the guardianship case first. He was good. Abigail had known he would be good, and watching him construct the argument was like watching a carpenter work. Skilled, economical, each piece placed with a purpose. The document was valid. The authority was clear. The children had been taken without legal process or notification. Miss Hartwell's conduct, however sympathetic in motivation, had bypassed the established channels that existed precisely to protect children and guardians alike. Judge Crane listened without expression. Nathaniel went next. He did not have a solicitor, said. He had declined Abigail's suggestion to retain one, saying that a solicitor would smooth the rough edges of what he needed to say, and the rough edges were the point. He stood before the judge and said what he'd said at Abigail's table, in almost exactly the same words, without deflection and without performance. He described the morning the documents were signed. He described what Hale had said and hadn't said. He described the 8 months. He described the night he'd arrived at Abigail's door. I failed these children, he said, near the end, not because I'm a cruel person, because I was a negligent one. I gave ground to someone I should have stood firm against, and 2 children paid for it. I'm not telling the court this to excuse my conduct. I'm telling it because I think the court deserves an accurate picture of how we arrived here. And that picture includes the fact that I should have acted months ago and didn't. Crane looked at him for a long moment. And the secondary clause in the guardianship document? Nathaniel described the presentation of the documents. He was specific: date, time, what else was in the stack, the exact phrasing Hale had used, The fact that he'd been in the middle of accounts that needed attention and had signed everything in a group. Crane turned to Hale. Mr. Hale, was the nature of the secondary clause explained to Mr. Whitcomb before he signed? A pause that lasted precisely long enough to be meaningful. The document speaks for itself, Hale said. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Shorter. The relevant provisions were available for review. Crane wrote something down. He wrote it slowly, and the slowness of it had a quality that made the room very aware of itself. Clara testified. She was direct and specific and did not embellish, which was, Abigail had learned over the past 2 weeks, simply who Clara was. A woman who dealt in what she'd seen and left the interpretation to the listener. Thomas Greer testified. He was nervous, and he showed it, but his account of finding Mercy on the floor of her room after Clara's dismissal was clear and uncontradicted. Then Crane looked at Samuel. You've brought the boy, he said to Abigail. Not accusatory, observational. He asked to be here, she said. He has something he'd like to say, if the court is willing. Crane considered this. He looked at Samuel with the considering expression of a man calibrating something. Come forward, son. Samuel stood. He walked to the front of the room with the same deliberate uprightness he'd used at the council table, the compass in his right pocket, his hands still at his sides. He stood before the judge and looked at him directly. My name is Samuel Reed, he said. My father was Captain Elias Reed. He died in January. He paused, just briefly. He asked Mr. Whitcomb to take care of us. He trusted him because they'd been through hard things together, and he believed Mr. Whitcomb was an honorable man. Another pause. I believe that too now. I didn't 2 weeks ago, but I do now. Something in the room shifted. Abigail felt Nathaniel go very still beside her. What I want to tell the court, Samuel continued, is what happened at the Whitcomb house. Not because I want Mrs. Whitcomb to be punished exactly. I want whoever decides things to understand what it was like. For Mercy. She's 6 years old and she stopped talking for 2 months. She stopped singing the song my father taught her. She slept on the floor. His voice did not break. It was remarkable, Abigail thought, the control in it. She's starting to sing again. I want the court to know that because I think it's important. What you stop doing when you're scared and what you start doing again when you're not, that's the real account of what happened. Crane looked at the boy for a long moment. How old are you? He asked. 10, sir. Your father taught you to speak plainly. Yes, sir. He said unclear language is how people hide from the truth. Crane's expression moved very slightly, in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was something in the same territory. He made another note. Then he looked at Prudence. Mrs. Whitcomb, you've heard the testimony. Is there anything you'd like to say before I give my ruling on the preliminary question of temporary custody? Prudence stood. She was still composed. She would always be composed. It was architectural in her, load-bearing, the thing that held everything else up, but there was something in the composition today that was thinner than it had been, less supported from underneath. I have spent my life in service to this family's interests, she said, to Nathaniel's interests, to this county's standards of proper conduct. What has been characterized here as cruelty was discipline, and what has been characterized as negligence was care, and I stand behind every decision I made in that household. She paused. But I recognize that the court's view of these matters may differ from mine. It was not an admission, but it was not the total confidence of the woman who had arrived at Abigail's door 2 weeks ago, either. Crane looked at her for a moment, then he looked at his notes. Then he looked at the room. On the question of temporary custody of Samuel Reed and Mercy Reed, pending full review of the guardianship arrangement, custody is granted to Nathaniel Whitcomb as primary guardian, with the understanding that the children will reside in a situation of his choosing that does not involve Mrs. Prudence Whitcomb having authority over their care or residence. He looked at Hale over the papers. On the question of the secondary guardianship clause, I am referring this matter to the county bar for review of how it was drafted and presented. I'll leave it to the bar to determine what, if anything, flows from that review. Hale's face did not change, but he was very still. The matter of Miss Hartwell's conduct on the night in question is not before this court, Crane continued, And I'll note that from what I've heard, it appears to be exactly what it was described as. A woman opening her door to two children in a storm. I don't have any further comment on that. He set down his pen. That was it. Not a dramatic pronouncement, not a sweeping vindication, just a man who'd been doing this for 22 years setting down his pen and reaching for the next matter. Abigail let out a breath so controlled that the person beside her probably didn't hear it. Nathaniel had his face in his hands for a moment, not weeping. He wasn't someone who wept, or at least not here, not in public. But his shoulders moved, and when he took his hands away, his eyes were red at the corners and he didn't address it. Samuel had turned to look at Mercy. Mercy was looking at the front of the room with her unreadable focused attention. Then she looked at Samuel. Then she looked at Abigail. Done? She said. One word, asked quietly, with a straightforwardness that was entirely her own. Done, Abigail said. Outside the courthouse, in the cold November air, Clara shook Abigail's hand with both of hers and said she'd heard there was a position open at the schoolhouse attached to the Ferris family's mill, and did Abigail think a word from her would be useful. Abigail said yes and meant it, and Clara went. Thomas Greer departed with the slightly relieved air of a man who'd done something difficult and was glad it was over and was already thinking about his next week. Abigail thanked him, and he nodded once and went. That left her standing on the courthouse steps with Nathaniel and the two children, in the November light that was thin and cold and bright in the particular way of late autumn light, which makes everything look very clear and slightly unforgiving. What happens now? Samuel asked. He was asking Nathaniel. Abigail noticed that, and noticed too that 3 weeks ago he wouldn't have directed that question to Nathaniel at all. Nathaniel looked at the boy. Now I make the house what it should have been from the beginning. Prudence won't be there. He paused. Thomas and the other staff can come back if they want, and I thought, there's a bedroom on the second floor with a window that faces east. Mercy could have it, if she wants it. I'll get rid of the floor in there. He said it entirely straight-faced. Samuel looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. It was small, and it was brief, but it was there. Mercy was looking at the sky, which was the pale, washed-out blue of a November afternoon that was going to be cold by nightfall. She had her hand in her pocket where she'd put the drawing, and Abigail could see the shape of her fingers pressed against the fabric. I want to go home, Mercy said. They all looked at her. She looked back at them with equanimity. Where's home? Samuel asked. Mercy considered this. She looked at Nathaniel. She looked at Abigail. She reached into her pocket and brought out the folded drawing and held it up without unfolding it, as if they could see through the paper to what was inside. Nathaniel looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at the folded drawing. She thought about the 4 figures, the 3 in front, the one in the doorway. The house that was her house, with the musket propped by the frame. We'll figure it out, she said, which was not a complete answer, but it was an honest one, and it was, for now, enough. They went down the courthouse steps together, into the November afternoon, into the particular kind of quiet that follows a hard thing. Not peaceful, exactly, because peace takes longer to arrive than that, but something. The specific quality of air that comes after a held breath finally released, after a thing you've been braced against finally stops pushing. The road back to Harwick Township was 12 miles. The wagon was cold. Mercy fell asleep against Samuel's shoulder before they'd gone 2 miles. Samuel stayed awake the whole way, watching the road ahead with the alert attention of someone who has learned that sleeping in moving vehicles is a risk, but who was, very slowly, in the specific physical language of a tired child who hasn't slept enough in months, beginning to lean against the side of the wagon. By the time they reached the township, he was asleep too. Nathaniel was driving. Abigail sat in the back with the children, and she watched the familiar shapes of Harwick Township emerge from the late afternoon dark. The mill, the inn, the spire of the meeting house, the turn that led to her road. And she thought about what the judge had said, which was not much, and what he hadn't needed to say, which was everything. When the wagon stopped at her house, Nathaniel climbed down and held out his hand to help her, which she took without comment, and he held it a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the purpose of helping someone out of a wagon. She felt the pressure of it, deliberate and quiet, and then he let go, and she went to deal with waking the children. Her house was cold when they came inside. The fire burned to ash, the kind of cold that settles into a house that's been left alone for a day. She built it back up from kindling while Nathaniel lit the lamps, and Samuel helped Mercy out of her coat and into the warmth. The fire caught. The room began to warm. Mercy sat on the bench, and Samuel sat beside her, and the compass was on the table where it always ended up, and Abigail went to put the kettle on. "Abigail," Nathaniel said. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hat still in his hands, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has something to say and is running the calculation of whether now is the right moment to say it. "Whatever it is," she said, "it can wait until we've all had something warm to drink." He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his hat on the table and sat down. "Yes," he said. "All right." The kettle began to heat. Outside, Harwick Township continued its evening. Fires lit, shutters closed, the ordinary business of people who hadn't been to a courthouse today and didn't know what had been said there, and wouldn't know until word made its way around in the way word always did, reshaping itself slightly with each telling, so that the story that finally reached most people would be different from the thing that had actually happened, but would gesture, at least, in the direction of the truth. Which was, Abigail thought, about the best you could hope for. The thing about aftermath is that nobody tells you how ordinary it looks. People who haven't lived through something difficult tend to imagine that resolution arrives with a certain ceremony to it, that when the hard part ends, the world rearranges itself visibly, that you can point to a moment and say that's where things changed. In Abigail's experience, it never worked that way. What actually happened was that you woke up the morning after the courthouse and the fire still needed building, the kettle still needed filling, and the 2 children sleeping in your loft still needed breakfast, whether the judge had ruled in your favor or not. She built the fire. She filled the kettle. She made cornmeal porridge, which was what she had, and she cut the last of the bread she'd baked 3 days ago. And she set it all on the table before Samuel came down the ladder looking like a person who had slept for the first time in months and was slightly disoriented by the experience. He sat down. He looked at the food. He looked at Abigail. "Is it over?" he asked. "The court part is," she said. "The rest takes longer." He thought about this, turning it over with the thoroughness he applied to everything. "How much longer?" "Depends on what you mean by over." She sat down across from him. "Prudence isn't going to disappear. She'll still be in the county. She may still make things difficult in ways that don't go through courts. And you and Mercy still lost your father, and that doesn't get resolved by a judge." She poured him a cup of water. "But the part where someone has legal authority to put Mercy in a cellar, that part is over." Samuel picked up the spoon. "That's the important part," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." Mercy came down 20 minutes later, moving carefully down the ladder in the way she always did, testing each rung. She had developed over the 3 weeks she'd been in this house a set of small rituals that Abigail had learned not to interrupt. She always checked the room from the bottom of the ladder before she stepped fully off it, a quick survey that probably looked like nothing to someone who hadn't been paying attention, but that Abigail recognized as the behavior of a child who had learned that the room you left and the room you returned to were not always the same room. Then she crossed to the table and sat in the chair that had become her chair, and looked at the porridge, and looked at the bread, and began to eat. No performance, no excessive demonstration of gratitude, which Abigail had been careful not to train into her. Just a child eating breakfast because she was hungry, and because the table was safe, and the food was there, and nobody was going to comment on how she did it. That, Abigail thought, was its own kind of resolution. Nathaniel came that afternoon, and he came with plans, actual written plans, which was a new quality in him and one that told her something about where he'd been since the courthouse. He had spoken to Thomas Greer about returning to the house. He had written to the cook who had left 6 months ago, a woman named Mrs. Hadley, to ask if she was willing to come back. He had been through the household accounts and had identified the specific funds that Prudence had, over 14 months, redirected toward her own expenses. and he had set those aside in a separate accounting as a matter he intended to address through his solicitor. "You got a solicitor," Abigail said. "I got a solicitor." A pause. "A real one. One who reads me things before I sign them." She looked at the plans spread on her table. They were thorough, and they were in Nathaniel's handwriting, which was the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a hurry and never quite slowed down enough to make it elegant, and there was something in the unelegance of it that she found more reassuring than anything polished would have been. "And Prudence?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "She's still in the house. I've told her she has until the 1st of December to make other arrangements. Her solicitor, Hale, which is an uncomfortable situation, has been informed that the secondary clause is going to be formally contested and that I expect the bar review to support that contest." He set down the plans. "She hasn't responded directly. She won't. That's not how she operates. Will she fight it? I think she'll make some noise and then recognize that the position isn't worth the cost." He said it without satisfaction, just assessment. "She's a practical woman, whatever else you can say about her." Abigail thought about the woman who had stood in her doorway with Gideon Hale and the full weight of her social position, looking at Abigail with the settled certainty of someone who had never encountered a door that didn't eventually open for her. She thought about the way that certainty had changed over the course of the council meeting and the courthouse, not collapsing but thinning, becoming less structural and more performed. "She was someone's child once," Abigail said. It came out more quietly than she'd intended. Nathaniel looked at her. "I'm not defending her," Abigail said. "What she did to those children was wrong, and it was wrong in ways that go beyond what any court is going to fully account for. But she's 63 years old, and she's buried 2 husbands, and she spent her whole life understanding that security for a woman in her position is not something you're given. It's something you take. She took it in the wrong direction, badly. But the taking itself..." She stopped. "I understand the impulse." Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the specific look of a man encountering something he hadn't been able to see until someone else pointed at it. "You're a more generous person than I am," he said. "I'm not being generous," she said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." She began gathering the plans into a neater stack. "What time do the children need to be at the house?" "Whenever they're ready. There's no rush." He paused. "I thought, if it would help, I could bring Mrs. Hadley back first, so the house feels different when they arrive, not the same as how they left it." She looked at him. This was the kind of detail that hadn't come naturally to him 3 weeks ago, and its presence now was not something she was going to remark on directly, because remarking on it would make him self-conscious about it. And the point was not to be self-conscious about it. The point was to just do it. "That's a good idea," she said simply. He nodded. He reached for his hat, then stopped with it in his hands, which was a thing he did when he had something else to say and was working out whether to say it. "I know this isn't the right moment," he said. "Then don't say it," she said. He looked at her. A pause that had several things in it. "You're going to make me wait." "I'm going to make you be sure," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his hat on his head and picked up the plans. "I'll come back tomorrow with Mrs. Hadley. The children can see the house before they decide. They'll have questions." "I know." He moved toward the door. "I intend to answer them." After he left, Abigail stood at the window and watched the wagon move down the road, and she allowed herself for approximately 30 seconds to feel the thing she'd been keeping careful governance over for 2 weeks. The warmth of it. The specific and inconvenient warmth of a person who had gotten through 31 years being largely self-sufficient and had found, somewhat against her expectations, that self-sufficiency was not the ceiling of what she wanted. Then she turned around because there were children in her house, and supper didn't make itself. The weeks that followed had the quality of a season changing. Not dramatic, but accumulative, each day leaving something slightly different than it had found. Samuel went back to the Whitcomb house with Nathaniel on a Tuesday, 2 days after the courthouse. He went carefully, the way you revisit a place that frightened you, alert, taking inventory, remapping the space against the memory of it. Mrs. Hadley was there when they arrived, in the kitchen, and the kitchen smelled like bread and onions instead of the cold institutional smell it had held under Prudence's management. Samuel stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a long moment. Then he went in and sat on the stool by the breadboard, same as Mercy had used to do, and Mrs. Hadley didn't make a production of it. She just handed him a piece of bread and kept working. He came back to Abigail's that evening and told her about the kitchen. He described the bread and the onions and the stool and Mrs. Hadley's complete lack of ceremony, and Abigail listened and understood that he was telling her it was going to be all right there, or that it had the beginning of being all right, which was the most you could say about any place in the early stages. "Will Mercy be okay there?" he asked. "I think so," Abigail said. "I think she'll need time, and she'll need to know she can come here if she needs to." "Can she? Come here, I mean, if she needs to." Abigail looked at him. "Yes, always." He nodded, absorbing this the way he absorbed most important information, quietly, filing it somewhere reliable. Mercy took 3 more days. She went on a Friday, in the company of both Samuel and Abigail, and she walked through the Whitcomb house with the careful, systematic attention she brought to all new environments, room by room, touching door frames and window sills with a light finger as if testing what they were made of. When she reached the second-floor bedroom, the one Nathaniel had mentioned with the east-facing window, she stood in the middle of it for a long time. The floor was bare and clean. The window was letting in the gray November light. The room was empty except for a bed frame and a blanket chest, and someone had put a small vase of dried flowers on the windowsill, the kind that held color through the winter. "My room?" Mercy asked. She said it to Nathaniel, who was standing in the doorway. "Your room," he said. She looked at the window. She looked at the floor. Then she crossed to the window and looked out at the east-facing view, which was the bare trees of the back property, the sky beyond them, the suggestion of the river in the middle distance. "The song goes east," she said. Nobody was entirely sure what that meant, but nobody asked because it clearly meant something to Mercy, and meaning something to Mercy was enough. She moved in that Sunday. Abigail felt the absence of them in her house, the way you feel the absence of something that had rearranged the furniture of your days without you fully noticing. Not a devastating absence, not a wrong one, but a real one. The loft was empty. The table had 2 fewer people at it. The mornings were quieter than they'd been in 3 weeks, and quiet had been her normal for 4 years, and was now, somehow, not quite as comfortable as it used to be. She taught her school. She tended her garden, which was mostly the business of winterizing it, cutting back and covering over. She corresponded with the county bar regarding the formal questioning of the secondary clause, a process that was slow and bureaucratic and required the specific patience of someone engaged in important work that shows no visible progress for long stretches. She also started going to the Whitcomb house on Wednesdays. It began practically. Nathaniel had asked if she'd be willing to continue working with Samuel on the reading assignments she'd been giving him, since the township school didn't have material at his level, and she'd said yes because the request was reasonable. But Wednesday afternoons at the Whitcomb house developed their own character over time, distinct from the crisis management of the preceding weeks. She and Samuel worked at the library table for an hour. Mercy usually came in partway through and sat in the chair in the corner with whatever she was currently drawing. Mrs. Hadley brought tea. Nathaniel came and went from the room in the way of a man conducting his own work nearby, while being entirely aware of what was happening in the room. It was Abigail thought on the 3rd Wednesday, watching Mercy draw something elaborate in the corner, while Samuel argued with her about whether a particular passage she'd assigned him meant what she said it meant. It was the most domestic scene she'd been part of in years. She wasn't sure when exactly it had become comfortable. It had happened the way most things happen, gradually, then all at once. On the 4th Wednesday, Mercy brought the drawing to Abigail the way she had with the house drawing weeks before. This one was different. More figures, more detail, and what appeared to be a table with people around it. Abigail counted the figures, 4 of them, around the table, a 5th near what might have been a window. "Who's the one by the window?" Abigail asked. Mercy pointed at the 5th figure. She pointed at Abigail. "You've put me in the Whitcomb house," Abigail said. Mercy looked at her with the straightforward patience of someone who doesn't understand why this is being treated as a question. Samuel didn't look up from his reading. "She's been drawing you there for 2 weeks," he said. "I thought you knew." December arrived, and with it the resolution of Prudence. She left the Whitcomb house on the 22nd of November. Not in defeat exactly, because Prudence Whitcomb was not someone who left things as defeat when another framing was available. She departed, as she had arrived, with 3 trunks and her personal maid, and she went to her second husband's sister's house in Albany, which had been available to her all along and which she had apparently preferred not to use because Albany was not where her ambitions were centered. Nathaniel told Abigail this in a letter, not in person, which she thought was the right call. Telling her in person would have required both of them to have an expression about it, and a letter allowed the fact to simply be what it was without ceremony. Prudence was gone. The house was fully Nathaniel's again, and the children's. The county bar had made a preliminary finding that the secondary clause had been presented in a manner inconsistent with proper professional practice, and Gideon Hale was facing a formal inquiry. None of this was, individually, a complete answer to anything. Together, they added up to something that looked, if you stood back far enough, like things having gone in the right direction. Abigail stood back far enough. She read the letter at her kitchen table on a cold December morning, with frost on the window and the fire strong and the school day not yet started. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it with the other letters she'd been keeping in the chest near the door, which was the chest she'd kept significant papers in since she'd moved into this house 4 years ago. The letter was not a declaration. It was a report, carefully written by a man who had committed to being more careful in his writing than he used to be, about the resolution of a set of circumstances they had navigated together. But there was a quality in it, in the way certain sentences were constructed, in the particular care taken around certain words, that told her things the letter didn't say directly. She was skilled at reading those things, having spent 31 years in a world that required women to communicate around the edges of what they actually meant. She wrote back the same afternoon. Her letter was also not a declaration, but it was warm and specific, and she told him that the news about Prudence was a relief, not because she had any interest in Prudence's suffering, but because she thought the children deserved the clear air of a house where the shadow of that threat wasn't always somewhere at the edges. She told him that Samuel had argued with her last Wednesday about a passage in Locke and had been, technically, not entirely wrong. She told him that Mercy had said 7 full sentences to her the previous week and that 5 of them had been questions, which was a very Mercy thing and a good sign. She didn't tell him the other thing. It wasn't time yet. She would know when it was time because she had always known things like that, and she trusted that knowledge more than she trusted most things. Christmas came to Harwick Township the way it always did, with cold and firewood and the particular social intensification of a small community turning inward on itself for the winter. People who had been cool to Abigail in the weeks after the council meeting, not hostile but performing a careful neutrality that was its own kind of message, began to warm again in the incremental way of people who have watched how something turned out and are revising their position accordingly. Edmund Ferris stopped her on the road a week before Christmas and asked after the children, and there was a directness in his asking that told her he genuinely wanted to know. She told him Samuel was reading above his level and Mercy was talking more every week. He nodded, and she saw him working something through, and then he said, "My daughters spoke well of you. They always have." He said it simply, without decorating it, and she understood it for what it was, which was an apology that a man of his type was capable of making without calling it one. She said she was glad, and she meant it, and they walked in the same direction for a moment before his road diverged from hers. On Christmas Eve, Nathaniel brought the children to her house. He didn't explain this in advance. He simply arrived at 4 in the afternoon with Samuel and Mercy, a basket from Mrs. Hadley, and a slightly uncertain look on his face that she'd come to recognize as the look he wore when he was doing something that felt right and was still in the process of confirming that it was. She opened the door and looked at the 4 of them standing in the winter light, and she stepped back and let them in. They ate Mrs. Hadley's food and Abigail's bread, and the meal had that quality of things that have been practiced enough to become comfortable. People who know each other's habits, who understand the rhythms of the other person at a table, who don't need to perform ease because it has arrived naturally, over time, through the accumulation of ordinary moments. After dinner, Mercy disappeared to the corner of the room and then reappeared with something in her hands. The piece of paper with the musical notes she'd drawn weeks ago, the approximation of her father's song. She brought it to Samuel and held it up. "Teach me the words again," she said. Samuel looked at the paper. He looked at Mercy. Something moved across his face that was both old and new at once. The grief that would always be there and the separate thing that was learning to exist alongside it. "All of them?" he asked. "All of them." He took the paper. He looked at it for a moment, although Abigail suspected he didn't need the paper. She suspected he had known every word of that song by heart since he was very small. Then he began to sing. His voice was not polished. He was 10 years old, and his voice was in the uncertain territory between a child's voice and whatever came next. And it cracked once in the first verse. He didn't stop. He kept going, and Mercy joined him at the beginning of the second verse, her voice clearer than his, more naturally musical, finding the tune the way she always found things. Completely, once she committed. Abigail sat at her table and listened to two children singing their father's song in her kitchen on Christmas Eve, and she thought about Elias Reed, who had taught Mercy this song when she was too young to understand it, who had made something in the small, specific way that parents make things, not for history, not for legacy, just for the child in front of them, and who had left it behind without knowing how much it was going to matter, without knowing that it would be the thing that measured his daughter's healing and the thing that carried proof of what she'd survived. That was the thing about the brave choices people made. They rarely knew what they were doing when they made them. Elias Reed hadn't known, giving his daughter a song. Abigail hadn't known, opening her door to a storm. The value of those choices wasn't located in the understanding that preceded them. It was located in the fact that they were made anyway, in the dark, without guarantees. Nathaniel was watching the children. His profile in the firelight was not the profile of the distracted, uncertain man who had arrived at her door drenched and ashamed 3 weeks ago. It was something firmer than that, still imperfect. He would always be imperfect. That was simply the truth of him, but more inhabited, more present in himself. When the song ended, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Mercy looked at Abigail with her direct, serious eyes. "Do you know it now?" she asked. "I think so," Abigail said. "The melody, at least." Mercy considered this. Then she nodded, as if this were satisfactory, and went to the bench by the fire. Spring announced itself in the way Hudson Valley springs always did, grudgingly at first, then all at once. March was still cold, but by April the garden was producing the first hesitant green, and the road that ran past Abigail's house was mud for 2 weeks, and then dried into the familiar packed earth of the warmer months. The school year ended in May. 2 of her oldest students, a boy named Marcus Webb, the chairman's grandson, and a girl named Dolly Crane, no relation to the judge, had learned enough that Abigail spent the last month working out what they were going to do next, because the township had no answer for students who aged out of the schoolroom. She wrote 3 letters on their behalf. She didn't know if the letters would accomplish anything, but she wrote them because doing nothing accomplished nothing, which was a principle she had found increasingly difficult to abandon. On a Saturday in May, approximately 6 months after the storm, Nathaniel came to her door in the morning. Not in the dark, not in distress, not with a problem to be solved or a plan to be reviewed. He came in the morning, in the May sunlight, and he knocked on her door and stood waiting when she opened it with the patient, slightly uncertain look of a man who has thought about what he's going to say and is no longer sure it's as well constructed as it seemed when he was thinking about it. She looked at him. She looked at the morning behind him, the early light on the road, the green of the trees, the way the season had finally committed to being itself. "You said to be sure," he said. "I did. I've been sure for 3 months." He paused. "I didn't want to rush you." She leaned against the doorframe. "I'm not easily rushed." "I know that." He looked at her steadily, and there was in his look the quality that she'd come to understand was one of the things she valued most about him. The specific quality of a person who sees you clearly and is not made uncomfortable by what they see. "I'm not offering you comfort," he said. "I'm not offering you security exactly, or at least not the kind that comes without requiring something in return. The children need someone who isn't going to disappear on them again. The house is big and I run it badly without help, and He stopped. started again with the slight self-interruption of a man who has rehearsed and found rehearsal inadequate. I have spent 6 months watching you make hard things look like the obvious choice, and I would like, if you're willing, to spend considerably more time than that doing the same. Abigail was quiet for a moment. It was not a perfect declaration. It was honest about its own imperfections, which was considerably better. He hadn't said anything about love, specifically, which was interesting. She thought he probably meant it, but that he'd been careful about the word, had decided not to lead with it, perhaps because words without demonstrated history behind them didn't carry as much weight as the history itself. 6 months of Wednesdays, 6 months of letters, 6 months of watching him become, incrementally and with visible difficulty, the person he should have been when the children first arrived. She had thought about what her life was and what she wanted it to be, in the clear-eyed way she tried to think about most things. She was 31 years old and she had built something here, her school, her house, her position in this township, from her own work and her own choices, and that building was real and it mattered, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. What she was being offered was not a replacement for it. It was an addition to it, complicated and imperfect, involving 2 children who would always carry something of what they'd been through, involving a man who was still in the process of becoming reliable. Nothing about it was simple. She had not, in her experience, ever found the good things to be simple. "The school stays," she said. "The school stays," he agreed immediately. "I won't relocate. If this is going to work, the arrangement has to account for what I've built here." "I've already thought about that." He had, she could see. This was not a surprise to him. The house is large enough that it's an absurd place for 2 adults and 2 children. The schoolroom here could be expanded. I have resources and you have the position, and between them the township might actually get a school that's properly resourced for the first time. She looked at him. "You've thought about this for a while." 3 months, he said. "I told you." She turned and looked back into her house. The kitchen table, the hearth, the loft where 2 children had slept and begun to heal, the window she'd stood at so many times watching the road, the musket on the wall, the chest by the door with the letters in it. Then she turned back to the morning and to Nathaniel standing in it. "Ask me properly," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Relief and nervousness, and underneath both of them something that was warm and unguarded in a way that the composed, uncertain man of 6 months ago would not have shown. He was not a smooth man. He had never been, and she suspected the attempt at smoothness would have been the thing that made her say no. He asked her properly. She said yes. They told the children that afternoon in the Whitcomb house kitchen, which was where most things of consequence seemed to happen now. Mrs. Hadley's domain, warm and practical, smelling of the bread that had become the constant smell of the place. Samuel listened to the explanation and then looked at Abigail with the careful measuring look she'd known from the beginning. He was thinking, she could see it, running the calculation. "Will you live here?" he asked. "Some of the time," she said, "and you'll come to mine. The schoolroom is going to be better, if your guardian follows through on what he told me this morning." Nathaniel made a sound that was somewhere in the territory of mild objection. "Will things change?" Samuel asked. He meant something specific by this. She understood him well enough by now to hear the specific meaning in the question. He meant, will you change? Will this change you into someone who isn't what you've been? "Some things," she said honestly, "not the important ones." He held her gaze for a long moment with those dark eyes that had been measuring things since the night he'd stood dripping in her doorway. Then he nodded, once, the same single nod he used when he'd arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to act on. Mercy was sitting on the stool by the breadboard. She had been listening to the whole conversation with the focused, cataloging attention she brought to things that mattered. "Your family now," she said. It wasn't a question. She said it with the simple, declarative confidence of a 6-year-old who has decided something is true and sees no point in making it more complicated than it is. Abigail looked at her. The girl who hadn't spoken for 2 months. The girl who had come down a ladder in a strange house and drawn a picture of it with 4 people in front of it. The girl who sang her father's song in the firelight and called it East and meant something by that which nobody had quite understood, but nobody had needed to. "Yes," Abigail said. "Family." Mercy nodded with satisfaction and picked up the piece of bread Mrs. Hadley set in front of her, and that was that. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage when it's happening. It looks like opening a door. It looks like picking up a pen and writing down what you saw. It looks like a 10-year-old boy putting his hands flat on a table and telling the truth to a room full of adults who might not believe him. It looks like a man standing in front of a judge and admitting, plainly, that he failed. Abigail had spent 31 years watching people mistake caution for wisdom and call it prudence, and she was thinking about that word specifically, prudence, and what it meant that the woman who had embodied its worst qualities had carried it as her name. Real prudence was not the management of risk by never taking any. It was the understanding of which risks were worth taking and which weren't, and then taking the ones that were, even when they were hard, even when you didn't know how they'd come out. She had not known, opening her door to the storm. She had known that something was required of her, and she had done it, and the rest had come from that. What she had learned, what she thought was worth knowing, not as a lesson packaged tidily, but as something she'd arrived at through the specific and imperfect process of living it, was that belonging is not something you're assigned. Not by birth, not by wealth, not by a legal document that someone slips into a stack of papers for you to sign without reading. Belonging is something you build. With your hands and your choices, and your willingness to remain present when remaining present is the hardest available option. Samuel had built it. From the moment he took his sister's hand in a storm and knocked on a stranger's door, he had been in the business of constructing something that nobody could sign away from him. Mercy had built it, one note at a time, finding the song back after months of silence, rebuilding the capacity for trust in a world that had specifically trained her not to trust. Nathaniel had built it the hard way, by being willing to see his own failure clearly and then do the work of becoming different, without demanding credit for the attempt. That was the harder path, she thought. It was easy to change when you had no choice. The question was whether you changed when you did, and whether you did it for the right reasons. And Abigail herself, she had been building it for 4 years before any of this happened, in the small daily way of a woman who had decided that her life was hers to make and had made it, room by room, lesson by lesson, choice by choice. The family that existed now, in the spring of 1819, had not been planned. It had not been arranged or designed or arrived at through any orderly process. It had been built the way most real things are built, out of crisis and imperfection, and the decision, made repeatedly by several different people in several different moments, to not look away. That, Abigail thought, was probably the only kind of family worth having. On a Wednesday in June, the last Wednesday of the school year, she walked the road from the township to the Whitcomb house in the late afternoon light. The road was dry. The trees were full. The Hudson Valley in June had the quality of a place that had been practicing all winter and spring for exactly this. The specific green of the hills, the specific brightness of the river where you could catch it between the trees. She arrived at the house to find Samuel in the garden, which had been replanted in April, and was producing adequately, working with a focus and competence that had become characteristic of everything he did. He looked up when she came through the gate. "You're early," he said. "The day was good and I walked fast," she said. He went back to his weeding. She stood for a moment and looked at the house, the stone walls, the windows with their shutters open, the smoke from the kitchen where Mrs. Hadley was doing whatever Mrs. Hadley did at this hour. The east-facing window on the second floor was open, and from it, faint and clear and absolutely confident, came the sound of Mercy singing. Not the 4 tentative notes of a frightened child in a stranger's loft. The whole song, words and all, sung by a 7-year-old who had decided, at some point in the months between then and now, that the song belonged to her, and she was going to sing it whenever she felt like it. Abigail stood in the garden in the June light and listened. Samuel kept weeding. He didn't comment on the song. It was ordinary to him now, which was its own kind of miracle, the way things that matter most eventually become the furniture of your daily life rather than the exception to it. When the song finished, the ordinary sounds of the afternoon returned. Birds, wind, the distant river. Abigail went inside. The compass was on the library table, where it lived now, in the house where the children lived. "Find home," it said on the back in their father's careful hand. They had.